So I am Joe House. I am the clerkship director at the University of Michigan. And I'm just going to have real quick the rest of our presenters go and just briefly give a one or two liner about themselves. Then we'll kind of show what the schedule looks like. And then we actually wanted to start out in a breakout room. So we have a little less participants. I don't know if we want to do it as one big group, but we can figure that out in a minute. So Jules, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Jules Young. I am an associate professor at Johns Hopkins. I just recently stopped being clerkship director, but I was for 16 years before my retirement from that position just in the past year. And I am the current president of the Clerkship Directors in Emergency Medicine Group.
Luann.
Hi, everyone. I'm Luann Lawson. I am an associate professor at East Carolina University, and I serve as the associate dean for curricular innovation and medical education.
Hello, everyone. I'm Matt Malone. I'm assistant professor of emergency medicine at The Ohio State University. And without getting into the details of how OSU organizes things, I'm essentially one of several assistant directors of the fourth year of medical school. And most of my time is spent doing assessment with the EM clerkship.
Hey everyone, I'm Kendra Perrick. I'm an associate professor at Vanderbilt. I'm the assistant dean for undergraduate medical education there, and I'm our director for emergency medicine education within our department. And so direct many of our student courses and oversee kind of all of our student activities within the department.
Hi there, I'm Will Peterson. I'm one of the assistant clerkship directors at University of Michigan. Recently completed a education fellowship here as well. That's it.
And I'm Adam Nicholson.
I want to show brief.
I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin and the associate director for medical student education within the Department of Emergency Medicine.
So I just wanted to briefly show the schedule since it has changed from what was posted. That's one thing with this is, when you try to get input from previous sessions, it's always changing, which is good. So we do want to do a brief breakout. Again, looking at the number of people, I don't know if we want to do it as one big group instead. Just kind of get to know who's in the room, get an idea of what your roles are, what you're looking to get out of this. We'll talk a little bit about assessment. Some different education or interactive education. We'll take a couple of breaks, talk a little about the learning environment, how do we work with those students that are not going in emergency medicine. We'll spend a fair amount of time working on how to write a SLO. Since the last time we gave this was one of the areas that a lot of people had questions about. We'll also talk a little bit about advising and doing the LCME. Since I've been clerkship director, we've gone through 2 different LCME visits, which are always fun. So since we do have, it says, a smaller group, why don't we not break out, and then we'll just kind of all go through and introduce ourselves, if that works for people. All right. I guess starting at the top, I'm actually, Errol, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Did you say Shelley?
He said Ariel, but Shelley, you're right there. Why don't you go for it?
Shelley, go ahead.
All right. Hi, I'm Shelley Zimmerman. I am the clerkship director at the EM residency in Norman Regional in Oklahoma. I'm an associate professor at the other OSU, Oklahoma State University. And I've been a clerkship director in the past and worked my way up to program director at another program, was there for 17 years. And I moved to this new program and back to doing what I love and plan to do this until I retire.
Based on my screen, Lauren, do you want to go next?
Certainly. So I'm Lauren Evans. I am an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, and I am the assistant clerkship director and just kind of moved into that role here in the last year. And so I'm still kind of learning my way around and appreciate all the assistance.
Leslie?
Hi, I'm Leslie Boydie. I'm actually at the Military Medical School at USIS in Bethesda, and I'm the outgoing clerkship director there, but thought I could still learn some great things from all of you.
My neighbor.
Chip?
Hi, my name is Chip Finch. Apologize on not having a camera today, but I'm a professor of emergency medicine at the Arizona College of Osteopathic Medicine, where I oversee the fourth year emergency medicine clerkship. Thank you.
Tony?
Hello, everyone. Tony Brar. I'm a clerkship director for the new School of Medicine at Kaiser Permanente. So this is a new role for me too. So learning pretty much everything from scratch in the beginning. Thank you.
David? I'm not sure if you're talking, David. We can't hear you, or at least I can't.
Hi there. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Hi there. My name is David Liu. I'm one of the emergency medicine residents at the University of Michigan. I'm one of the second-year residents with a heavy interest in medical education. I am here kind of like looking forward to learning things about the med ed career path and learning from everyone else here.
And Jake? Or Jared, why don't you go ahead?
Hey everyone, Jared Lamert. I'm one of the chief residents at University of Missouri. I'm going to be starting on as junior faculty there this upcoming year and joining as the assistant clerkship director. So looking forward to learning from you guys.
So a couple questions that we, I don't know if Jake's on, I want you to introduce himself, or now we can kind of keep going.
Yeah, sorry, I got, I'm on my cellular network. I don't have any video right now, but yeah, I'm Jake Kesterson. I'm the program director for the residency at University of Missouri. So I work with Dr. Lambert there, and mostly just trying to learn a little bit more about the clerkship side of things, since we kind of work together hand in hand so much.
All right, well, welcome. I don't know if Ryan, if you want to introduce yourself, or Ariel, since you guys are.
Sure. My name's Ryan LaFollette. I'm one of the APDs here at the University of Cincinnati, member of the program committee. So we'll be helping out kind of with any technical assistance if needed. Appreciate you having me.
Hi, my name's Ariel. I'm a fourth year medical student actually at Stanford University, and I'm one of the medical student ambassadors. So helping out with that technical assistance and tweeting and social media things.
Did I? Oh, actually, yeah, Dan, sorry. Dr. Axelson, I missed you.
Hey, no worries. Yeah, good morning. Dan Axelson, just assistant clerkship director at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. And I've been there about 3 years now. So excited to learn some more.
It's probably because Dan and I email back and forth so often, and that's why I missed him.
Yes.
And he's kind of hiding between Kendra and Ryan. Did I miss anybody else? So a couple of things that we wanted to kind of talk a little bit about, obviously, introduce ourselves. This is a small group, so please, as we're going through our slides, speak up, especially if you have any questions at all. We should have, plenty of opportunity to, work through things and change things up a little bit. Now, is there anybody, I know there's someone's starting with the new medical school. So who is actually starting a new emergency medicine rotation? And even if you want to just throw it in the chat, if you don't have a video or speak up, no one. All right, anybody have an M3 rotation? So a couple of people, okay. So at Michigan, ours is we actually have M3s and M4s, so we have a combination of both. And then, so everybody else would be an M4 rotation, or anybody's rotation in elective. So definitely got a couple of people in electives. So we don't have specific sessions talking about that. But, again, we should have time to speak up about, the M3 versus M4, starting a new rotation. So Tony says we'll be starting a clerkship rotation for year 2 this year and building M3, M4 as we speak. And it looks like actually Sean has joined us. I don't know if Sean wants to speak up and just give a quick who he is and where he's at and what his role is.
Hey, everyone, Sean Conley here. I'm with Leslie Voidy at the Uniform Services. Just actually took over as clerkship director from her. Sorry, trying to merge old SAEM accounts with the new, and so it's the typical technical difficulties logging on. But here to learn what I can from years of wisdom that you all have to share. Thanks.
And is it Larissa?
Hi, how are you? I'm sorry, I'm joining a little bit late. What are we doing?
Oh, sorry. We are just introducing ourselves, what our roles are. We're talking a little bit about like what our, if you're in charge of a clerkship or working a clerkship, required versus elective, what year you have students you have.
Oh, I'm Larissa Petty. I am the clerkship director at Rutgers Rapid Wood Johnson in New Brunswick. Our clerkship is a 4th year required clerkship. Although in the last year it's been something else. And we're actually going through big curriculum design now. So in the next couple of years, it might be something else again. So I'm kind of interested in hearing what other people doing at their sites to get an idea of what we can maybe try to do at our site.
Okay. We definitely have some time toward the end for like any, for a lot more questions. We have about 20 minutes at the end slotted for question and answer. So we are going through things and, don't touch on areas that you guys have questions about. We'll definitely try to touch on them toward the end. So no, Jules, if you want to go ahead and start.
Sure. Just give me one sec. Slideshow. All right, so I am going to kick us off right now with a discussion of assessment and assessment methods for our clerkships, which might feel a little bit like putting the cart before the horse, because obviously you've got to teach students a bunch of stuff before you can assess them on it. And we are going to cover some specific instructional methods and try to give you some ideas for that. But assessment's an incredibly important piece of what we do because it has real impact on the students. It potentially affects their competitiveness for residency. It affects their comments in their dean's letter and their class rank. It affects their SLOs. So how we approach assessment is a high stakes game, and I think it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about. So I just want to reiterate what Joe said. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, disagreements, just jump in and ask. Don't hesitate. But otherwise, I'll just run through some thoughts that I have on this topic, and we can have a little bit of Q&A at the end. So there's a lot of goals for assessment of medical students. Hopefully one of the things we're all thinking about is their professional formation. Assessment and the feedback that we give them is going to drive their professional growth. We've all heard the phrase that assessment drives learning. So while we know that our students are well-intentioned and they want to master all the content that we put in front of them, knowing that there's going to be a test definitely helps with motivation and focus, and reinforces what we consider to be important in the curriculum. Assessment also helps us figure out who needs help, right? So not every student is going to have the same aptitudes. Not everybody learns at the same rate. Some students are going to need more assistance. Some are going to need less. And assessment can help us get insight into that. And it also allows us to make decisions about students. It lets us stamp them off. You are competent to do this thing. It's what drives our grades and our class rankings. So it's a very important piece of what we do. Now, just real quick basics. The term assessment refers to measurement of competency. So it is some type of measurement of the student's ability to do something. And assessment can be either formative, meaning that the focus of it is to give the student insight into their own performance so they can help improve it, or it can be summative, meaning that the goal of it is to assign grades, pass-fail determinations, etc. We're not going to talk about evaluation here today at all. Evaluation refers to the curriculum itself. So evaluation seeks to measure how well did my program work, as opposed to assessment, which seeks to measure how well did my learners perform. Now, the concept of competency, we've all heard the word kicked around. So it simply refers to the extent to which a particular construct has been mastered by a learner. So you take a little nugget of knowledge, a skill, an attitude, and your competency determination is whether the student has mastered that adequately for some new phase in their clinical progression. Competencies have to be objectively defined, and they have to be measurable. So by definition, competencies can't be internal states. They do include attitudes, but what you're measuring are the behaviors that reflect that attitude rather than the internal state of the learner themselves. So they all have to be things that we can see and touch and wrap our brains around. Now, all of you, since seems to be a pretty seasoned group, I'm betting all of you know about competencies, milestones, and EPAs, so I'm not going to belabor this too much. But competency, as you know, is big picture stuff. It's a big domain of health professional performance, communication skills, patient care abilities, professionalism. Those are all competencies. Milestones seek to describe levels of performance within a competency. So a milestone would be an attempt to say this learner has reached X level of proficiency for this overarching competency. And then lastly, an EPA is down at the bottom of this inverted pyramid, and it's really a unit of work. It's an observable unit of professional practice. So you can watch somebody go do an EPA and be like, yes, you did it right, or no, we've got a problem and you need remediation. And just to clarify a bit further, here is the AAMC Patient Care 1 competency. It's gather an essential and accurate information in a healthcare encounter. And then in the emergency medicine milestones, we have a milestone that is designed to define strata of competency within that broader competency construct. And you can see the early learner will perform and communicate a decent history, and the level 2 learner will focus their history and they will address more urgent concerns. And then the level 3 learner will build on top of that, and they'll be able to figure out what they really do and don't need to know when time or information are short. So the milestones take the competency and break it down into strata. And then the EPAs get really googly, and I'm not going to go too far into this, but basically there's multiple competencies within every EPA. So an EPA is a unit of work. It's a simple, observable thing that you can watch a person do, but something like taking a history requires that they know how to interview a patient, that they have effective communication skills, that they have enough clinical knowledge to know what questions to ask and how to prioritize them. So all of those broader competencies feed into that final unit of work, which is the EPA. So that's kind of how the different things interdigitate. And there's pros and cons to basing our assessment paradigms on any one of these, right? If you try to measure broad competencies, you're going to be looking at the learner with very sort of fuzzy, gestalty kinds of strokes. You're not going to be able to get really granular on what they do or don't know, or what they do or don't need to work on. Whereas if you measure them entirely on EPAs, you're going to have a very reductionistic view of the learner. You're going to get almost like one of those dot paintings where you get a whole bunch of different dots, but you've got to stand way back from it to see the bigger picture of how are they progressing as a clinician. So there's pros and cons, and in an ideal world, we probably will incorporate some elements of all of these constructs into our assessment paradigms. Now, when we think about what our goals are in creating assessments, whether we're measuring competencies, milestones, EPAs, or other, we want assessments that are reliable and valid. And reliability, as I'm sure you know, refers to precision and reproducibility. So if I do the same assessment over and over and over again, am I going to get the same result for this learner? Obviously, taking into account things like maturation and the learning curve, am I going to get consistent results? Whereas validity addresses whether I'm really measuring what I'm trying to measure. You know, if I write a test, am I measuring the student's medical knowledge within this content domain? Or have I written a bunch of crappy items that just measure their ability to take tests effectively? That's what validity refers to. The relationship between the two, people often get confused. So you need reliability to have validity. You can't have a valid but unreliable assessment. That's not a thing. But reliability is a binary yes-no proposition. You either have a reliable assessment or you don't. It either performs the same way over time or it doesn't. Two raters either see the same thing and rate it the same way or they don't. Like, reliability is a yes-no, whereas validity exists on a continuum. And the idea behind validity is that you make an argument for validity. You don't have like, I'm valid. You can say, I have done these things in the process of developing and implementing my assessment to make it a valid assessment. And these are my arguments for why it's valid, but there's no such thing as a inherently valid or invalid assessment. And that's an important concept when you move ahead to thinking about individual assessments, because we're all going to have to come up with ways of assessing our learners in clerkships. And we want to kind of have a flavor for what's going to be reliable, what's going to be valid, and where we're going to run into difficulties. So the number one most commonly used piece of most assessment paradigms is clinical assessment in the workplace, right? You guys have all done this. You work with a student on a shift, they hand you a form or there's something on your phone or whatever, and you go dunk, 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 and you rate them in a whole bunch of different categories. That's our shift card. Shift cards and other forms of clinical workplace-based assessment have been shown in study after study after study after study to lack in reliability and to lack in validity evidence. We continue to use them because it is what we've always done. It's how we ourselves were assessed. And letting go of the idea that this is a useful way to capture learner performance is very difficult. And we don't have a lot of great substitutes. So this remains a big piece of the puzzle, but cracking the nut on how to make it reliable and valid is a real challenge. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Direct observation is a little bit better. So if you go to the bedside and you watch the student do a thing, you watch them suture, you watch them take a history, you're more likely to be able to do that reliably and more likely to actually be measuring what you're trying to measure. The multiple choice exams, which predict very little about how good of a doctor anybody is going to be, are actually quite good at generating reliable assessment data, and they're quite likely to be valid, especially when you use national exams like the SAM exam or the NBME exam. Internal exams are very, very difficult to make reliable and valid for the simple reason that you never get enough sample size to be able to keep up with the psychometrics and redo the test or revise questions on the test in a way that's going to actually get you to the point of reliability and validity. At most, you probably have the bandwidth to do this once a year, and that's if you have good psychometric support, and it may be less than that. And when you're working with small, non-stable sample sizes, it's very difficult to get data that are really going to help push you in the right direction. Simulation-based exams, your OSCEs and that kind of thing, are generally pretty reliable, at least in terms of inner observer, but validity really depends on the process that you use to develop the exam. And same for things like computer-based case simulation, formalized review of student charts, those kinds of things. You often can hit reliability, but the validity of your assessment is going to have a lot to do with how you approach it, how you train your raters, how you design your tools, etc. Any comments, questions, thoughts, feelings so far? All right. So this is kind of sad, right? So I've just basically told you guys that like your job is to go out and assess learners, but all the tools that we have at our disposal to do it kind of suck. And I'm sorry to be the one to break this to you, but this is the cross that we bear in many cases as medical educators. High quality assessment is really, really hard. And all we can do is the best that we can do. But the good news is there are steps that we can take as clerkship directors to move the needle. So you can improve reliability and validity of your assessments by using the best possible assessment tools that are available to you. So try to use national benchmarked exams rather than homegrown exams. Try to use clinical rating tools that have been adopted by multiple institutions and have a little bit more data behind them. Make sure you train your raters. That's an incredibly important piece of this, and we're going to talk more about that. Try to get your raters to go to the bedside and actually watch people do things and give them feedback about it and document how they did, as opposed to just gestalting, where you're almost always going to measure how much they liked the person as opposed to how well the person performed clinically. Try to make sure that if you do have internal assessments, like if you don't have the ability to use a national test or something like that, and you want to have an internal assessment, that you are at least doing your due diligence to get expert review of your assessment content, that like everybody in your expert group agrees, yes, these are good questions to ask. They make sense. They're clear. These are all the things that the experts would actually do in this situation. And as much as you can, try to actually analyze your assessment data. I realize that's something that you probably need some statistical support to do, unless you're a super nerd like me. But it's well worth doing that periodically to make sure that you know what's going on with your assessment tools. So let's talk about my gentle friend, the shift card, for a minute. So I already came down pretty hard on clinical workplace-based assessments, and I really mean it. While these tools are very convenient, they're quick and easy, it feels wrong to not assess the student on how they did during their shift. They're actually not that great at measuring much of anything. So one thing to just accept in your heart early on is that almost every clinical workplace-based assessment that has been studied through something called factor analysis, where you look at subscale within an assessment tool, comes to the same conclusion. And that's that these tools measure two things and two things only. They measure the constructs have been called skill and duty. So they measure clinical knowledge, reasoning, differential diagnosis ability, understanding of treatment, observation and reassessment, sick, not sick, all of those kinds of clinical things that we care about are half of the tool. And the other half of the tool is all the soft skills. It's all communication skills, work ethic, diligence, patient-centeredness, compassion, all of those kinds of things tend to congregate together in another factor. And it's important to know that, because when we develop these assessment tools that have like 16 different domains of performance, and we're like, were they compassionate? Were they punctual? Did they reason well? Did they do procedures good? All of those kinds of things. We're not really measuring any of those things. We're measuring how good were they clinically, and how comfortable are we with them as physicians in terms of their communication and work ethic. So that's something to accept right away. We also know that if you have a global item on a shift card, that is going to tend to predict all the individual domain scores. So really, individual scores don't add a whole heck of a lot if you have an overall score, unless you maybe have different scores for the skill element and the duty element. Another bitter truth about these workplace assessment tools is that they tend to measure more about us than they do about learners. So studies that have looked at this, you know, in a quantitatively rigorous way, have found really high error contribution to the actual scores, and the majority of that comes from the assessor. It comes from me being a hawk or a dove, or having my own personal philosophy about how I'm going to go about grading people. So just remember that your rater is a huge variable in this process, and the more you can rein in your rater, the better results you're going to get. The other thing I just want to mention about this is bias potential, and we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. So you guys have all seen these. They're usually anchored rating scales. A lot of us have these thrust upon us by our institutions. So whether they're perfect or terrible doesn't really matter. Our institution tells us this is what you're going to use, in which case you have to make the best of it. A group that I'm involved with has studied this, and there's actually incredible variability across institutions in terms of what is measured, how it's measured, whether it's ever reviewed for reliability or validity. Like, all of these things are incredibly variable. So your grades and scores are apples to oranges to pineapples to, you know, lawnmowers across the board. They're really not comparable. There is a national clinical assessment tool that was derived by expert consensus several years ago at one of the CORD conferences, and that effort was led by CDEM. You know, in the interest of full disclosure, I was part of that group. So I have, you know, special feelings about it. I've ironically never been able to use it because my institution mandates a perfectly stupid tool. But it is something that's available to you. So if you're in a position of needing to develop your own tool, you potentially don't have to, because there's something out there that is not perfect by any stretch, but it's not terrible. I won't belabor this. It's available in the literature. If you Google National Clinical Assessment Tool for Emergency Medicine, you'll find this very easily. We were able to whittle down the average of 10 to 16 domains that people measure to 6. We were not able to persuade our group to go lower than that. So we probably still have, you know, we still have subscales or factors within this tool, just like other conventional tools. We looked at professionalism as a binary construct, because it's not really like, oh yeah, you're kind of a 3.5 for integrity. Like, you either lied or you didn't, right? So we treated that as there are either concerns or there aren't. And then there's a global assessment that mirrors the SLO, the goal of which was to help people with their stratification process for students. So this is out there if you want it. If you don't want it, that's fine. Lots of us have reasons why we need to use other things. But the good news is you don't have to develop your own thing, so please don't. It's really hard to do well. The NCAT took probably 3 years to develop and to get experts to agree on what should be on there and what it should look like and how it should be measured. But if you really do need to develop your own assessment tool, or you're determined to for whatever reason, there are some best practices that you should use. So try to go small rather than big. Don't try to measure too many different things, because you're not really going to be measuring them. Provide behavioral anchors that describe what different performance levels look like, so that your raters have something concrete they can anchor on when they're trying to select a level for students. Use the appropriate scale. So if something is really a yes/no question, don't try to put it on a Likert scale. Try to avoid the saint or the axe murderer descriptors, because nobody will ever choose those categories. So if you're like, you know, this student walks on water and floats through the air and shoots rainbows out of their eyes, nobody's ever going to select that. Similarly, nobody's ever going to select the category that says, you know, the student is a walking assassin. So try to include descriptors that are realistic, that that actually describe performance that the preceptors will see in real life. It's hard enough to get people to use the entire scale on any planet, but when you start putting in like really extreme descriptors on either end, it gets difficult. And the last thing is, don't let people get away checking a bunch of low boxes and not explaining why, because a student who does poorly deserves to know why. That is our responsibility to them. It is our ethical duty to them, and we need to do it. So just a couple words about rater training, which is really, really, really important. One, your faculty will hate it and resist it and tell you that they don't need it. They're wrong. They do. The goal is for you to develop a shared mental model of what each level of performance looks like. So when everybody uses the tool, they see a student level of performance and they're like, yeah, that looks like a 4 on this tool. That's what I'm going to circle. You want everybody to be able to see the same thing and rate it the same way, which requires that that groups be oriented to the tool, that you make your expectations clear. You know, an average student on this tool is about here, is about in the middle. They're about a 3 or they're about a 4. Wherever you've said that, you need to make it clear to your preceptors that that's how you expect them to grade. You're always going to have hawks and doves. You're always going to have people who hate everyone. You're going to have people who love everyone. You've got to monitor for them and you've got to rein them in. So when you find people, you know, giving all high scores or all low scores, look for your outliers and retrain them. Those people need talking to. And until you get them to adjust their behavior, you're going to have skewed data. And you really, really, really want to look out for bias. And you want to remember that this isn't like a one-off thing where like, oh, I fixed my tool, everything's great. This is going to be an ongoing process for as long as you conduct assessment. So there are a few pitfalls to look out for, which are pretty important. One is the halo or horns effect. So remember I said that one of the big things that we're measuring is ourselves. Well, another big thing we're measuring is how much we like the student. So if the student shows up late for the shift and you're like one of these ultra punctual people and that pisses you off, odds are you're going to be harsher on that student for the entire rest of the shift because they've given themselves horns, right? Whereas if the student is somebody that you really like, you know, maybe you have something in common, you're going to be more lenient with that student. You need to be aware of those tendencies and do your best to mitigate them and to try to choose the appropriate rating categories regardless of your feelings about the student. There's also this phenomenon of spearing. You guys have all seen this, right? Where like, you know, you have all these different domains that measure all these different things, and then somebody just circles like 3 all the way down all of them. And you're like, what the heck am I supposed to do with that? So that's problematic. You know, that tells me that the person is just gestalting the student rather than attempting to parse out what they were good at and what they need to work on harder. So you want to give your raters feedback about that. This is my personal favorite. One time I went to a Dove rater and sat her down and was like, I've noticed that you give everybody all 5s, including the student that you personally emailed me about because you were concerned about their performance not being anywhere near that of their peers. Can you help me understand this decision? And she was like, well, my philosophy is. I was like, okay, stop talking right now. You don't get to have a philosophy. Assessment is all about everybody getting on the same page to do things the same way. So I don't care what our individual raters, how they feel grading should be done or how it was done at their institution or what they learned about it. They need to drink the Kool-Aid and get on board with the way that you're trying to do it so that everybody is looking at students in the same way. And then another one that frustrates me immensely is when you get either very low or very high scores with no narrative comments. And you go to the person and you're like, dude, this is like the lowest score I've ever seen on an eval. Why? What did this student do to you? What can they do better? And people almost react to it kind of like, you know, that famous old saying about great art, which was later applied to pornography. Like, I know it when I see it. I know a good student when I see him. I know a bad student when I see him. It's not your job to do that as an assessor. It is your job to develop a diagnosis for why that student did badly, to figure out what behaviors they engaged in that made you concerned, and provide concrete feedback for how to adjust them. And that's a really important part of being an assessor that a lot of times people need explicit help with. The last one is fear. there's a lot of concern about hurting students by telling the truth about how they did on in a given shift, because there are, the assessor's afraid, like, oh, this person, this is comment's going to end up in the dean's letter, or this is going to keep the student from getting honors or whatever. The bottom line is that for your individual assessors, it's not their job to worry about the consequences of assessment. That's your job as the grader. Their job is to tell the truth. And it's important for them to feel empowered to do that. And then the last thing that's really worth talking about, after which I think I'll shut up, is bias. So you guys have probably seen some of this literature, but it's really just bears mentioning every chance we get. There are gender and racial disparities in medical trainee assessment at every single stage of training, from the medical school selection process all the way through to fellowship. And there's been a lot of literature about this lately, like showing not just like, oh yeah, we think this is a thing. This is like an actual measurable thing. And even in the AOA realm, when you control for grades, class rank, extracurriculars, advanced degrees, all of the variables that go into student sort of overall quality, white people are more likely to get into AOA than any minority, which has created a big stir. And a lot of schools have actually suspended their AOA elections because they feel like they can't participate in a system that's so flawed. So there are real issues in bias. There was one great study that looked at narrative assessment language. So they took dean's letters and analyzed qualitatively, looking for use of standout terms, empathy terms, and what they called bare minimum terms. And basically they found that white students were much more likely to be described as like the best or the top of the class or exceptional. Women, because we are all nurturers, were more likely to be described as caring and compassionate and kind, which is great. I mean, I want to be caring, compassionate, and kind, but I also want to be exceptional and the best, right? But that was reserved largely for the white dudes. And get this, Black students were more likely to be described using those baseline, like bare minimum type terms like competent. I mean, the last thing you want is to have a letter of recommendation written for you where somebody describes you as, Dr. Young is very competent. That doesn't exactly inspire the reader to recruit you for the program, right? And this was a real statistically significant difference across letters. So this is something, and it's important to mention, this is something that I'm sure the writers didn't set out to do. They weren't like, you know what? I really don't like women and minorities, so I'm going to write these letters this way. This is all based on unconscious bias and the way that our brains work. The only way we can combat it is to be aware of it, and to really actively monitor for it and try to mitigate it in ourselves. So we want to have conversations about this with the people who are assessing our students in the clinical area. We want to analyze our assessment data regularly, to look for gender or racial differences that may reflect unconscious bias on the part of our raters. We want to at least, we don't all have the means to do formal qualitative analyses, but we want to at least screen and see, gosh, are we describing people in different groups using different language? Are we painting them as different types of people? And most importantly, we want to have zero tolerance for any kind of discrimination in any form where we find it, and do everything we can to stamp it out. So I think I'm going to stop there. I had some more stuff, but I really feel like clinical assessment is the biggest piece that we need to cover for this topic, although I'm happy in our discussion to talk about other forms of assessment or anything else you guys want to discuss. Questions, comments, thoughts?
So just for those that don't have the chat up, a couple things that came up. So Matt Malone had mentioned that assessment drives curriculum. Luann Lawson mentioned that objective data is helpful in showing faculty where they lie on the assessment continuum. Kendra had mentioned also found that it's helpful to provide feedback to all faculty residents, not just those that are outliers.
Absolutely.
And we mentioned much like the RVU data, and we share the RVU data and where people stand, so we're sharing their evaluations. Kendra also mentioned a quote from Brené Brown: "Clear is kind, unclear is unkind." Now, one thing that we had done for a while, and then it kind of became a manpower issue since we've had some movement in some help that we have, is we actually for a couple of years provided about mid-year all the faculty and all the residents what their mean scores were on our assessment evaluation and what the mean score from everybody at that site was. So we actually have 3 different sites that our students rotate or can take as a required rotation. So that way people knew where they stood and where they stood in comparison to their peers or other people. Now, we found out no one was really a huge outlier, surprisingly. But at least, again, we definitely got emails, "Oh, I didn't realize that was so hard," or "Wow, I didn't realize that was a pushover." So at least people are thinking about it, where they lie and how they do their scoring. So any other comments, questions?
Yeah, I think that's a great approach. We actually do a faculty report card that covers, how you go about assessment. And one of the things I would love to add to that is specifically looking at bias language and differences in scores across groups. Yes, Matt, sorry.
I was just going to say, I've asked this question once or twice in other venues before, but has anybody here ever considered using sort of an individual z-scores as the average of that rater, such that if I give somebody above my average, they get a better score versus below my average, as opposed to the average over the entire group? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. I think one of the things that's hard about that, to do that at the individual rater level, is you often don't have a large enough sample size for each individual rater to get a stable score. So the reliability of that, like, unless you have just a massive data bank and everybody's doing a bajillion assessments, the reliability of that is potentially suspect, which is why it's usually done when people do use Z-score method, they usually do it across the whole clerkship rather than with individual raters.
I was gonna say, we have looked at it at the individual, and we actually do have enough support, which was nice, that we were provided the Z-score adjusted for our faculty and even our residents, but we decided it actually was not worth the time spent to do that, because their Z-scores didn't vary, unfortunately, didn't vary enough to make really a difference. So we use it more for those students that are borderline for their grades. So if someone's borderline for us between like a pass and a high pass, and we look and everybody is positive Z-scores, and oh, you know what? You on average appear to score better, and this might be kind of what Jules was talking about, score better than the average for the individual. So we might take that into account if we're going to bump someone's score up, or hey, you are a negative Z-score for everybody, we're going to leave you where you fall. So we have looked at it. It has not made a big difference for us actually doing the pure adjustments. So I'm going to put a comment: do any of your shops use the same assessment modalities for all clerkships at the school? So a more standardized approach.
So I'll speak to that a little bit. And in full disclosure, I was involved in the NCAT group as well. And so the NCAT was really, I think, targeted to emergency medicine, because it's very focused in some of the things and some of the anchors but sort of using that as a model, I went backwards for our own institution and got some consensus amongst all the other clerkships about the things that could be measured across all clerkships. And so created a standardized form for all of our M3 clerkships, but then everyone has the option to be able to look at things that are pertinent to their specialty. So different procedural type of things. I encourage people to sort of have specific assessments for specific things if you feel that they are different, but it does give us some consistency in the approach, at least some of the anchors across them. So doing a history and physical is relatively similar in a lot of different ways.
And beyond the clinical assessment tool, I know of a number of institutions that have, if not the same exact assessment algorithm, they at least have some policies governing the how score breakdowns are done and that kind of thing. So like at our institution, for example, clinical evaluations are not permitted to be more than 60% of the final grade. Every shelf exam is always worth the same percent on every clerkship. But then there are these discretionary pieces where, depending on, your specialty specific learning objectives and what other assessment methods you're using, you can add in other components to get those objectives that are unique to your specialty.
We have a competency-based curriculum, and so our clerkships all have the same competencies that are assessed using milestones, and those are actually continuous from first year through the fourth year. It's just the expected target where you are on the milestone, much like in residency, is different, but it's the same tool that's used across all four years of the school.
And ours is a kind of combination of what Kendra and Jules are talking about. So we do have our competencies, but each individual rotation was able to choose which of the competencies that we'd be able to measure. So the competencies between the different rotations are going to vary a little bit. Then we do have kind of the one global assessment, as Jules mentioned, because since everything kind of ends up being very similar, the one global assessment. But what we've run into and has caused a lot of anxiety with students is, so ours is actually a 9-point scale, but a 4 is different for like emergency medicine compared to pediatrics, compared to surgery. So so students may be on one rotation and 5 is kind of the pass score, where another rotation of 5 may be a high pass score. So they don't necessarily know what it means when they get these different scores. And like I said, it's caused a lot of unhappiness. I shouldn't say a lot, but definitely it's caused unhappiness with students because of these variations. Luann mentioned they use a similar approach as Jules mentioned, some parameters built into policies, but gives clerkship some flexibility in assessment methods.
Yeah, I'm not going to go through these in like a lecture-y kind of way, but I did actually just want to hit on some grading points since we're veered into that. There are a lot of issues, like we focused on sort of how to make an assessment tool as good as it can be. But then once you amalgamate everything together into a grade, there's a whole bunch of other sort of philosophical issues that you need to wrestle with. And two big ones that are really challenging are, one, normative versus criterion-based grading. So, as you probably know, normative refers to how well students do relative to each other, whereas criterion is how well they do relative to a standard. And, everybody in medical education is supposed to sort of drink the competency-based education Kool-Aid and measure students against specific, milestones or standards of performance, which is great. Until you accept the fact that means if you're a really great teacher and every single one of your students achieves those objectives, then they all get the same grade, right? They all hit that same milestone. Yet we are expected as emergency medicine educators to write SLOs, which are entirely normative in nature. So there's a real tension between those two pieces that's worth acknowledging. And then there's also questions about whether you allow different pieces of grading to compensate. So for example, the student who a compensatory grading model would mean everything's just like a weighted average, you tally it up and you're done. But that would mean that if a student like totally blows their exam, but they were awesome clinically, they can still honor, right? Whereas in a non-compensatory model, they have to achieve a certain benchmark for every component of your grade. And that allows you to address like red flag things like exam failures or professionalism lapses, which wouldn't be well addressed by your compensatory model. So I bring that up because you guys, asked about like, does everybody have sort of an institution-wide approach? And we actually institutionally have decided to all be non-compensatory with individual grading components, because we've had a number of incidents where students have had particularly professionalism lapses, but also sometimes failures in other areas, and still ended up like, skirting over that honors threshold because that piece of the grade was relatively small. So that's something we're thinking about when you are thinking about the big picture of your grading, and then also how you're going to handle that tension between gosh, I want everybody to achieve the same things and learn the same things, and I want everybody to succeed, but I also have to differentiate by tertiles to write their slows.
Does anyone perform quarterly or yearly assessment in groups with raters to help with variability and norming on the assessment model, or is it mostly done individually or remotely? And then Kendra posted to do an annual training with faculty and annual training with residents and ad hoc training if groups, if there are group needs or individual needs. And then Luann mentioned that I think quarterly would be helpful to improve inter-rater reliability, but we honestly don't have the person power to do it. All right. So why don't we go ahead and move on to Kendra talking about interactive education.
All right, so we are going to discuss how to utilize active learning strategies in classroom-based sessions. And so I thought first it would be helpful just to get a poll. So if you're on your computer and you want to go to the URL, it's pollev.com/my name, which is KENDRAPAREKH 687. Otherwise, you can text my name 687-222-333 to join the poll, and then you'll be joined. And the question is, what percentage of clerkship or course time is spent in classroom-based activities? And this is anonymous, so you don't have to worry. Well, looks like either one person responded or everybody has just a very low percentage of classroom activities. All right, we'll try the next one and see. And so for those that do have classroom-based activities, how do you feel about the amount of active learning that you have built into your classroom activities? Not enough, just right, too much. All right. Well, it looks like a lot of people feel that the amount they have is just right, and so that's great. So I encourage you as we move through this to please speak up and share how you're able to do that, some best practices, how you engage your faculty or your lecturers in these activities to add in active learning strategies. And so the purpose of this talk is really just to recall instructional strategies that can help increase active learning in classroom-based activities, and really to commit to increasing the use of these active learning strategies. So I'll throw it out there for the group. People can write in the chat or speak up, but when I say active learning, what do you think about, or how do you define active learning? %80 of people said they had it, and they thought it was good. It was right where it should be. So what does that mean to you? Case-based learning, everyone participates, hands-on skill-based, actively problem solving, not one way, the opposite of stand and delivery lectures, simulations, procedures, Yeah, that's great. And so as we'll see in a bit, what we just went through is a commitment exercise, which is one way to also actively engage people. And I try and think of it, you know, there's like the sage on the stage, which is your teacher centered, which is really more the transmission of information, compared to more active learning, which is the guide on the side, which is really meant to be learner centered, and you're there to help facilitate learning. And this is shown to lead to increased retention, more deeper learning, ability to solve more complex problems. This is one quote I really like, and it helps remind me that, you know, learning is a process, and we infer that learning has occurred because we see a change in behavior, or we see, you know, a change in a skill or performance. But learning is a process that happens inside the learner, and we can't make it happen. We can create conditions that foster that, make it more likely to happen, but we really can't. You can't make someone learn. And so, what are some of the goals of classroom-based teaching? You know, it's still important, and you know, you still use it, but really to help develop a knowledge base, particularly if you want to do some level setting, maybe for explaining difficult concepts. Develop higher order thinking, so asking people to analyze, appraise versus just recall or list. Helping people transfer their knowledge to other contexts or problems. So taking what they already know and how can they use that in new situations, as well as really an opportunity for collaboration and developing shared knowledge among the group. And then I think one of my favorite is really like teaching how to learn. So sort of the metacognition of learning. What are the best practices for, you know, deep learning, retention, and applying and developing new strategies. And so one of the important things as we talk more about active learning strategies is to just really remember there needs to be congruence between your objectives and your instructional strategies. And as we just saw from Jules' talk, right, your instructional strategies really should drive your assessments as well. And so sometimes, you know, I get caught up, there's like new technology or a new teaching technique, and I'm like, yeah, I want to try this, but you really need to make sure that it's really the appropriate thing for what you're trying to achieve. Oftentimes we'll have to use multiple instructional strategies, and you know, it's always good to think about available resources. Some of the things we'll talk about, and maybe people can share what they've done, but like case-based learning or team-based learning can sometimes take more resources than you may have available. Here are just some things that I think are like quick and easy add-ons to any lecture talk that you're doing, or if you're coaching, you know, a more junior learner, that they can really just kind of add into their lecture. And so the first is like a pause procedure. So there are a couple different ones. There's like the 60-minute paper where you literally just ask the students to write, you know, what did they learn from it? What questions do they still have from it? Just giving them space to pause and process. The muddiest point is another one where you can ask, you know, what was the most confusing thing, or what are you still most confused about after this session? And that can be really helpful also to help you prepare if you're giving like a series of lectures for your next session. Case-based scenarios can be used the beginning, the middle, the end, and they help engage and contextualize information, and can also model kind of that thinking, like how you think through that case, which can be hugely helpful to learners. As I mentioned earlier, commitment exercises where you really get the participants to commit to something. There's lots of tools that are free, like you can use Poll Everywhere, Slido, Kahoot. It can be really fun for this as well. And this again has been shown to be associated with higher test scores and longer knowledge retention. Concept maps. Has anybody used a concept map before? Familiar? So this is really, it helps create those interconnections between information. And so I'll show an example that we use in our course that emphasizes like foundational science. And so the students they give a poison patient, and so they have to think through, like, you know, sort of how are they going to approach that patient. And so this is just one example where they're sort of mapping their understanding of different toxidromes, and then applying that and thinking about how they would then approach the unknown poison patient. And so this can really be helpful for students to link, you know, different but related concepts. You can also utilize social media. I'm not a social media expert, but I know there's a lot of people who can use it successfully and can have, chats or follow-up information on social media that can just make things a bit more engaging. And so I think these are pretty quick and easy to do. The next group of activities take a little bit more time and planning, but are still pretty, quick additions to a standard kind of lecture format. The first is think, pair, share. And so we've all probably done this where, you think about something and you share with someone next to you or in a little virtual room, and then you report out to the large group. This can be particularly helpful if you have the more quiet learners in the group, because this gives them time to process and then still be able to share with the group. Snowball can be really fun. It's kind of a variation on think, pair, share, but you have teams of, the group breaks into teams of 2, and then teams of 2 join together for teams of 4, and then you can have teams of 4 join together for teams of 8 until you kind of reach this big, this big snowball sort of consensus about what's going on, or, conversation saturation. You can set up debates to have, that also can potentially help students get into, primary literature, and then really also helps with perspective taking and some of those other skills as well. Gaming is really increasing, and so there's all kinds of emerging literature on gamification. We do in one of our courses to help students understand some components of health system science and operations. We use a board game where they get to build their own emergency department and simulate care through it. They love that, but they do learn a lot of really core principles of operations management that way. Jeopardy is can be a fun and easy way to make learning fun. And then role play, although no one really loves role play, it is an effective tool if done well. One thing I found that can be helpful is if you're doing a session where you have a co-presenter with you, is for you to do a role play first, and then that sort of sets the stage for people, and they do get more comfortable and can engage. The next group of things are more like lecture alternatives, where you would have to, essentially revamp your session to sort of fit it into this, but they are more active than the things that we've talked about previously. And so the flipped classroom is one of those. And so there you have some type of pre-class assignment, there's classroom learning, and then post-classroom learning. The pre-class stuff is done asynchronously, independently. The biggest times I've seen this go poorly is if it's not clear that this work's supposed to be done before class and students aren't doing the pre-class work, then they're coming unprepared, and a lot of that classroom learning time is spent just going over the stuff they were supposed to have done in the pre-class setting, and also not being clear like what's important to learn from the pre-class information, because then sometimes students spend hours sort of on the wrong thing, and then when they show up for the classroom learning, they can be pretty upset that they spent X amount of time reading off subject. The classroom component is usually some type of application and synthesis exercise. It's synchronous, so it's all done together, and it's better if it's cooperative, so students are working with one another. And then there's supposed to be post-class learning, which helps to really, deepen the learning and solidify what they've done in the classroom learning. And this is another area where I've seen the flipped classroom model not really fully sort of implemented, where there's actually no classroom learning. And so most of the studies that have shown benefit from this model follow, the full thing: pre-class, class, post-class. And so dropping off the last part may not have the full benefits. And then there's team-based learning. And so this is a variation basically on the flipped classroom. And so there's preparation again, which is like individual, there's guided learning. And then in phase 2, it's a readiness assessment. And so there's usually individual tests of readiness. Oftentimes they use these like scratch off sheets where students basically grade their own work and see how they did, what they did and didn't understand. Then there's a group readiness or team readiness test, class discussion about the assessment, and then again some type of application exercise where the team has to work together to solve problem or apply information. It looked like from the chat some people may be using this. Is there anybody that wants to share any tips on how they've implemented team-based learning? No takers. All right. There's also problem-based learning or case-based learning, and there's either a problem or a case assigned, and then the group identifies what they need to know to either figure out the problem or to work their way through the case. And then typically, the group will assign different members, different components of the problem, or different things to learn about for the case, come back together, and then they'll learn and apply, or go out and learn and then come back and apply together to their assigned problem or case, and either come to a problem resolution or come to some conclusions about the case. And then there was also a lot of people who mentioned that they do procedures and simulation, which are great for active learning. This group of things presented was if you have to do classroom learning or have classroom learning activities, and just kind of want to make them as active as possible. And so I thought we would just take a moment now, and if you do have a classroom-based activity, just think about, one thing that you heard from this session that you are committed to doing, or interested in doing, or want help from this community here to implement into your classroom-based session. And so I'll give everybody just like a minute or two to think on their own, and then we can share after. A minute seems so long when we're silent on Zoom, but we're just about there. So is anybody willing to either share? You can unmute yourself and speak, or just type in the chat, one thing you think you'd like to do to try and create more active learning in your course or clerkship. So someone mentioned commitment exercises as an easy way to break up lectures. And if you're low tech, like you could it's depending if you're virtual or in person, but I've also used index cards too for commitment exercises. So if you're, technology is not your thing and you don't like online polling, then you can use index cards. So commitment exercises are really where you ask the learner just to commit to something. And so it may be that you review some material and you have a couple, questions that you make them do some key multiple choice questions, or like the beginning of this session, trying to get people to commit to a definition of what they thought, active learning was, or things that they do in active learning. It's really just a way to get people engaged and involved in the material, and have them either put out there verbally, virtually, by flashing an index card what they think about the material. And it helps get them early involved, and just thinking about the stuff that you're going to be talking about. More use of simulation, that is always great. How do people manage that around like time and resource commitments to increase simulation use? Any tips that people have found helpful?
We incorporated our teaching rotation that the third year residents do. And so that's one of their responsibilities that come along with the teach rotation, is that the year or the months that we have the intensive students, they come and participate in sim. And I think it really helps both sides learn, and kind of opens up a little more time where the students have some kind of face-to-face interaction.
That's really great. Luann mentioned she likes to use commitment exercises for orientation during review of the during review of the objectives, what do they want to learn, and then reviewing at mid clerkship feedback. Any other thoughts from others? All right. Well, implementing active learning strategies can help lead to deeper learning and then hopefully ultimately improve patient care. And hopefully this has at least provided some new ways to help you incorporate more active learning strategies into your classroom-based activities or to support others who are in your courses and clerkships to help implement more active learning strategies. Any other questions? Or thoughts, or maybe something really cool that I didn't cover or something that works really great that you want to share? All right, thank you all.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and do a quick break. So we have set for a 10-minute break. So we're a little bit behind schedule now. If people are okay, if we can plan on coming back about 10:25 Central or 11:25 Eastern, depending on where you are. And then what Luann Lawson mentioned, please don't log off during the break, just mute and turn off your cameras. And then we'll get back into it. So I think it's a short break.
All right, so welcome back. Hopefully you had time for a quick bio break and a quick screen break. And so for the next little bit, we're going to be talking about planning for non-EM bound students. And so from the beginning, it looked like there were a lot of people who had required experiences in emergency medicine. And so this refers to any students taking a required experience who are not planning for a career in emergency medicine. We'll go ahead. It's the same poll as before. And the question here is, how do you feel about teaching non-EM bound students in your course or clerkship? This is a modified Baker long face scale. A is full smiles, B is lukewarm, and C is anticipating some tears. So it looks like almost everyone. Oh, we got some smile faces. That's great. For those that are smiles and like non-EM bound students, I would love for you to share as we move along your tips and tricks for maintaining your enthusiasm. And so next, if you want to just type, how would you describe your experience with non-EM bound students? If you pick a word, particularly for those who maybe put up middle of the road face, we didn't have any crying faces up there. But how in general would you describe your experience? Meh. That's I like that variable. Student dependent. Future consultants, fun. Thinking that's maybe hit or miss. All right, so kind of it seems like, you know, a bit of a mixed bag. And sometimes when I talk to people with non-EM bound students, they sometimes get lumped into a bucket and, you know, may generally be seen as more difficult or, you know, sometimes unmotivated. And I see a lot of, you know, variability, student dependent. And I would suspect that may be what some people are calling disengaged. And so this next slide I will show the objectives, discuss the benefits of having non-EM bound students in your rotation, and then we'll talk about developing a systematic plan to help maximizing the learning experiences for those non-EM bound students, and hopefully maybe can take the sort of meh and turn it maybe into a little bit of a yay, steal the E, make a yay and the H out of there. And really just trying to be proactive and thinking about this. And so this graph is based on personal experience and absolutely no data. But from doing this and from talking with others, you know, in general, those M3s who are in required experiences, or however your curriculum is structured, those students who have not yet chosen a specialty tend to have higher motivation, are excited about, you know, coming into the rotation. And then as we slide into year 4 and students have chosen specialties, and you have students who have not chosen emergency medicine but are required to sit in on the course, that sort of, you know, motivation engagement tends to go down. And then you do have a small uptick at the end in general when the 4th years start to freak out and realize like they have to do this in a few months, and sometimes that motivation and engagement will pick back up. And so really what we're going to talk about is how to sort of mind your mindset when you approach this. And so thinking about being, you know, proactive rather than reactive to these situations. You know that you're going to have these students in your course. And so where are your pressure points? Where are your, you know, sort of pain points, if you will? And how can you be proactive about managing that? And we'll also help to cultivate, you know, a desire for these students. And so trying to just change how you think about it, seeing it as a challenge and opportunity to grow yourself as an educator to kind of meet the demands of this. And so Some of the benefits to you as the clerkship director is you can have a huge influence on a student's specialty selection. Oftentimes, students get excited about specialties based on who they interact with and their personal interactions with residents and attending. So it's a huge opportunity to really try and recruit those students with the qualities that we are looking for into emergency medicine. And it can also set up, long time professional relationships as students move forward in their career. It's an opportunity to impact students' view of emergency medicine. And so oftentimes students may have preconceived notions about what emergency medicine is, what we do, how the emergency department works. And so this is really your opportunity to kind of help show them how it really functions. And whether in a professional or personal capacity, all the students that you see are going to interact with the emergency department in some capacity. So helping them understand what the triage process is designed to do, what the role of emergency medicine is, why the specialty developed, can all help form their views and potentially even counteract misinformation that they may hear when they're rotating on other rotations in the hospital. It can help promote collaboration, and someone alluded to that in the word cloud. Even if they're not going into emergency medicine, these are our future consultants, and these are our future colleagues. And so helping them understand, when you call for a consult, what that really means, why sometimes you may not be able to, pick up the phone the first time they call you back, what you're looking for in a consultation can all be really helpful and foundational as these students move forward. It also helps to provide you as a clerkship director a seat at the table. And so, this can provide political capital within the School of Medicine for you as well as the department. And so that can be hugely helpful when it comes time, to ask for resources, curricular time, etc., to be afforded that opportunity to be one of the required clerkships for the school. And then in addition to benefits for you, I think there are also benefits for non-EM bound students. And while we could probably list many more than this, these are just kind of the ones that I think are particularly unique to emergency care. And so, evaluating patients who have undifferentiated and urgent presenting problems. This hardly happens in other rotations, because oftentimes students are on specialized services where there's already a diagnosis. And so they don't just get to try and understand what generalized weakness means or what dizziness is and how to sort through that. I think Jules showed an example, but really beginning to perform focused histories and physicals, understanding what that looks like, working on differentials and really that prioritization piece. And oftentimes, at least in our school and rotation, it's one of the only times students actually perform procedures and urgent interventions. Many of our hospitalist teams have procedural services that the students don't currently rotate on. Under systems-based practice, that task prioritization is really key in emergency medicine. And there's lots of health system science, which is, emerging as very important, and a lot of schools are developing curricula around that occurs within emergency medicine. There's a lot of processes in the emergency department, the role of emergency departments, in the healthcare system, and then interprofessional teams and communication. And so it's a great, we found it's a great laboratory for health system science as well. And then in practice-based learning and improvements, because we all know the ED is a little bit more chaotic than some of the floors and things can be, is really helping students recognize, recognizing their limits, what they can and can't do, and helping them know when to appropriately ask for help. And so now that we've seen hopefully some of the benefits, we're going to talk about, a systematic plan. So how can you, plan for this and really try and program this into your learning? And obviously these things are not just good for non-EM bound students, they're good for all students, but they may be particularly helpful for those not planning careers in emergency medicine. And so this is my very bare bones diagram of learning. And so it takes a teacher or educator, it takes a learner, and then there's interaction between the two of them, right, that occurs in a learning environment. And so learning is social. And so within each of these things, we'll sort of look at, first things that are most directly under your control to things that are least directly under your control as the educator. And so first, you want to make sure to set clear expectations and have a good attitude about things. Use learner-centered approaches. You want to try and optimize the learning environment, and Luann's going to do a whole, or sorry, not Luann. There'll be Matt and Joe are going to talk about the learning environment a little later as well. And then really trying to foster motivation in these students. And so for setting and communicating clear expectations, I would strongly encourage you, you want to have clear expectations, not just for like clinical, but also for all the non-clinical components. And you want to make sure that all who interact with the students are also aware of these expectations, because it's really difficult, for students if they walk into the ED and no one knows what they're supposed to be doing and they're not sure what they're supposed to be doing because maybe they didn't pay attention. And so it's really helpful that everyone that interacts with the students knows what they're supposed to do. We made like a little badge buddy that on the front side actually identifies what course the student is in so that they don't get asked that question over and over again by different people. And then on the back side for that specific course, it lists some of the key objectives or things that they're supposed to be doing while they're on clinical shift. And so that way it's really easy for them to talk with the other supervisors and educators in their environment. You want to make sure you orient the students to the course, its structure, as well as to the emergency department, right? We probably, all remember being in a new place and not knowing where the restroom was, or if it's locked, how to get in there. And so making sure you're thinking about all those, taking that beginner's mindset and thinking about all those small things that are just automatic for you, but that it may be really important for students to know. And particularly non-EM bound students may be even more overwhelmed in the emergency department environment. And so how you can really help just orient them and make them feel more comfortable. And then I've also found it's helpful to just orient students to how emergency physicians think, because again, we're our own distinct specialty, and how we approach problems in clinical medicine is different than what the students have otherwise experienced. And so recognizing that, clearly communicating that to them, and then giving them some resources can be really helpful. It can also be helpful to emphasize, translatable skills and the benefits of an ED rotation. And so, someone, maybe going, into psychiatry may not, immediately see kind of what skills they can use from an ED rotation to psychiatry. So really helping to make that connection and make it explicit for the student. And always inspect what you expect. And so if you have, criteria that you've set out or things that students are supposed to be doing, then you want to make sure that you at least checked, not everything every time, but just in general, you want to check to make sure that those things are happening. Otherwise, that there's sort of not expectations anymore, and word gets around pretty fast that you don't have to do that thing. And then it can take a lot of work on the back end to get things up and running again. You want to make sure to have a positive attitude, even if, like the apple, you have to just, staple on your shiny red front when you're student facing, but you want to try and be open and approachable for your students. You want to be enthusiastic and practice mutual respect with them as well. Like, we have to treat the students with respect, know their name, know what they're interested in, acknowledge their past experiences. Students can bring with them a wealth of experience. And so making sure we're not just assuming they don't know what they're doing or that they don't have any experiences, and really acknowledging their presence on shifts and not just, ignoring them or leaving them in a corner. And I really think we can also expect competence from them. People will often, rise to the level of expectation. And so just because someone's not going into emergency medicine, doesn't mean that they are not able to perform the things that are necessary in the clerkship. And so really just kind of setting that bar achievable, but not just putting it at sort of the basement or minimal level. Next, we'll talk just some learner-centered approaches, making sure get to know the students. I think, as Luann had talked about, learning goals can be really helpful. So really understanding, what your students are thinking about. You want to try and encourage self-directed learning. You can have resources for the students to look at to do some deeper learning on their own. If there's the opportunity to individualize part of the curriculum, if you have multiple sites and there's the opportunity to provide students with choice, that can also be really, really empowering as well. And you also want to think about your bedside teaching techniques that you're using. And so ones that really get the students' thoughts first, so like the 1-minute preceptor or using the SNAPS model, again, can be really, really helpful to engage that student and feel more learner-centered. And so I like to use the term the learnable moment rather than the teachable moment, because the teachable moment implies that it's about the teacher and when you're ready to teach, but that may not be the point where the learner is actually receptive and ready to learn. And so I think as educators, you know, it's our job to look for that moment when the learner seems ready for, you know, what we have to teach or for what that opportunity is in the moment. All right, we're going to pause here and just have you reflect on maybe one of your worst rotations in medical school. And for like myself, that's been quite a while now, but you know, there's still those moments for most of us that probably really stand out as not being really great, or just really would hope you would never have to do again. And then I will ask if anybody feels comfortable to either type into the chat just a little bit about what made that moment, you know, less than ideal for you, or if you want to share out loud as well. Anybody have any thoughts that they want to share, or talk about an experience and what was it that made it so difficult? All right, no takers. Well, I will say when I've talked about this in the past, it's usually either it's the environment, it's, you know, the people or an interaction that was really you know, really difficult. You know, I remember mine. I got yelled at by a surgeon just for, you know, just for walking into the room, and you know, that was pretty memorable, and got called, you know, not nice things in the moment. And it looks like in the chat, a student who disliked working in specific areas of the ED and then told his co-student negative aspects about it. Oh, so we can talk about that a little bit as we move forward. And if we don't get to your question, just make sure we'll raise it at the end again. And so we'll have a session on the learning environment, but just briefly here, it's really important to create and maintain a positive learning environment that both supports and challenges the students. And I think it's also important to just be mindful of professional humor. You know, we have preconceived notions about other specialties like they do about us. And it's, you know, I put it in quotes because, you know, you just have to be thoughtful about, you know, what we're saying and how we're expressing or processing information in the moment, because it can be interpreted differently by different people. And, you know, as always, you know, what you do often speaks louder than what you say. And so you are always the role model. And so if you are the face of student education, you're the clerkship director, the assistant clerkship director, people are going to see what you do on shift, how you treat the student, how engaged you are with the student. And if you're not the one who's constantly, you know, bringing the students in or talking to the students or giving feedback, then there's no one else that's going to do that. And so really, you know, taking that part seriously. We don't often talk about, you know, role modeling, but it is always there, and it's part of that hidden or implicit curriculum. And so trying to use that in a positive way to really demonstrate, you know, positive and strong ways to interact with students. And so the last little piece we'll talk about, so we talked about clear expectations, having a good attitude, learner-centered approaches in the learning environment, is really trying to foster motivation in students. And so motivation is multifactorial, but regardless of which theory of motivation you look at, they all basically have these three kind of core tenets to them. And so students, when they're thinking about doing something, they're going to think, you know, can I do it? Which is the self-efficacy, that belief that if they're able to perform a task or engage in something, do I want to do it? And so that's thinking about the value of the task. So what is the value of the task to them? And then what will happen if I do the thing? And that's task expectancy. So, you know, what are the potential positive or negative outcomes? What's, you know, what is the benefit or the risk in doing whatever is being asked of them? And so we can engage those things to help foster motivation. And so you really want to try and promote mastery orientation and growth for students. And so it's not just about getting the grade, but it's about learning the material, because it's important to care for patients. And so giving permission to try and fail can be really powerful. Rewarding growth, you know, oftentimes we say like, made improvement, right, is often viewed as this negative thing, but that's really what, you know, really what learning is. If someone comes in and they can already do the things you're asking, like, and they can still do them at the end, they haven't really learned. They may not have learned actually anything at all. They just, you know, came in with a higher skill level. And so really thinking about ways that you can recognize students who are putting in effort and who are demonstrating improvement in skills, being growth oriented in your feedback. And so not, you know, praising students for being smart. Oh, you're so smart, or you're so talented, or you're great at suturing, but really trying to focus more on, you know, the process. You must have read a lot, or you must have really worked hard on your interpersonal communication skills. You know, I like the way you held a needle driver. Your suture was, you know, appropriately positioned. And so using that growth oriented feedback. Really helping to emphasize the value of course activities. So especially if it's not apparent to the student, like why they should engage in this thing, we would all love for it to be, you know, apparent and the student should just be like, I just want to learn, but that's often not the case. And so really making those links explicit for them so they can really see that value. And again, emphasizing translatable skills. And so that's the task expectancy. Like, you know, maybe you're, you know, not gonna necessarily, you know, see patients, you know, with chest pain or in your practice, but, you know, from this you can learn how to, you know, take a more focused history, or you can then help if you have to answer, you know, call lines and someone has chest pain, or, you know, just trying to think of ways to help again them see the value and the benefit of doing the things that you need them to do. And so here is a brief case, and I think we can get to the question in the chat as well, sort of through this. And so it's April, so the end of the year, 1 month before last class before graduation. You're the clerkship director. If you have a mandatory 4th year EM rotation, you have a non-EM bound student who's taken the course and has successfully matched at their #1 choice in a highly competitive program, and they've let everybody know about it. The student added your course late actually, and had to, you know, get extra permission because they actually forgot it was a required course, and so they just tacked it on at the end. You've heard from other faculty that students lazy and unmotivated. One of your colleagues said, you know, I sent the student home early. It's not like they were doing anything. And then you just come on your shift. It's a night shift. The department's busy. You see the student sitting in like the workroom area maybe, and they're clearly checking email, you know, on the computer. You sort of get whisked away into this complex resuscitation. And so you come back after a while, and the student's actually still sitting there with their email open, and they haven't, you know, it's pretty clear they haven't done anything. And so how would you handle this situation, or how maybe you've experienced this? How have you handled the situation, and what could you do to prevent this? I'll stop my screen share. I can chat. Any thoughts?
So I can go and start. So as part of our orientation, I actually have a slide on kind of what you need to do well on the rotation, and I actually kind of address this because we have had this before. Not so much that it was the last rotation, but it was someone who was just disinterested, and I found out later they actually had a lot of personal stuff going on in the background. That's why they were kind of disconnected. But you know, I talk about, you know, how many patients you should expect to see per shift, and you know, students that have struggled in the past, or sometimes those that are disconnected and not engaged in seeing patients. So when you kind of bring it up as, you know, these are the students that potentially fail, I think that kind of wakes them up a little bit. So I think, you know, saying someone who's your last rotation, you don't want to fail, this is what you need to do, I think sometimes prevents some of that.
I think too, engaging them and what they're anxious about starting residency, sort of review for them that they probably haven't done a lot of clinical experiences lately, and sort of try to identify what are things that they could do to help them prepare for internship and first day of residency, and try to identify some specific things that they can do that are helpful for them in their specialty. It is a good way to engage them.
Yeah, and coming through in the chat too, asking students, like you mentioned, what they want to get out of the last few minutes of their education. They're still paying for it, right? So they should be motivated to try and do something. And then address the student regarding what they would like, what they would like to achieve. And so I think those are all great things. And then, just reminding them, like Joe said, about the expectations of the course, and, not making assumptions about the student, like the faculty who just assumed they were lazy and unmotivated, and really just being curious about, what's going on with the student, and this is the expectation, what's preventing them from achieving that. And so I will stop there. And then just to address the question, it was a student disliked working in a specific area of the ED, told the co-students negative aspects about it, what to do in the situation, and how to change the perspective. And so I will say, when we've had that in the past, we do, like at the end, like a group debrief with all the students about their experiences. And so that can be a helpful time to, level set and label if it was an abnormal experience that student had because of volume or acuity or whatever it was that day, or staffing, to really just label that as an anomaly from experience, recognized for what it was, and then, affirm to the students that you recognize it was less than ideal, and how you're going to sort of address that moving forward. And then we've also used like students as advocates, so students that have had positive experiences, putting their quotes, into our orientation, like this site, this was the best site, this doctor gave really great feedback, or just using the students as their own advertisers for different areas. Anybody else have any other thoughts or experience they would like to share?
So we had experience with the nurse tech shift where they actually spent a shift with the nurses. And it was one of those where, kind of like Kendra mentioned, depending on who you worked with was kind of what the experience was. So it kind of got around with the students. Oh, this is horrible. It's a waste of time. So one of the things we actually did is just actually change the objectives of what that shift was for. Because it was written in there at one point that it was a procedural shift and they're going to do lots of IVs, and which is not the case. So we really kind of just changed the perspective and the objectives on that rotation, or on that part of the rotation, to fit more of what students are actually doing.
Did it work?
Yes, it did. So the evaluations, at least, and maybe the students are just happy because they got kicked out with COVID and now they're actually back in. But our comments have greatly improved, and we originally shortened that from an 8-hour shift to a 4-hour shift based on student feedback. The last quarter evaluation, students actually wanted it to be longer. As Kendra put, branding and marketing, exactly.
Yes. All right. Well, remember, having inbound students is beneficial. Think about just having, a systematic plan and trying to be proactive in those situations rather than reactive. So thank you all.
I think I'm up next. Everybody able to see my presentation? Perfect. I'm Matt Malone. I'm going to be talking about the learning environment. I would like to preface a lot of the content that's being presented was actually developed by Dr. Nick Kaman, who has stepped back a little bit from some of his numerous roles and allowed me to present this content on his behalf. The objectives are to define the learning environment based on the standard 3 of LCME, which we're going to talk about, describe some positive and negative features of the learning environment and trainee mistreatment, and then some strategies to improve or optimize the learning environment. So what is the learning environment? The definition's a little silly, but it's the structural and social context wherein the learners learn. So it's where the learners learn, great. But it should be noted that the learning environment does have pretty strong influences on learners' behaviors, emotions, and their performance within clerkship. So given when presented with a different learning environment, the student may act differently, have different feelings towards their experience, and actually perform better or worse based on the environment that they're in. The other thing I think that's really important that I didn't really consider before is when you're trying to measure the quality of the learning environment, you're not necessarily always getting an accurate representation of the learning environment itself, but rather kind of the learning climate, which is how students perceive the learning environment itself. There are numerous, it's very multifactorial how what goes into and what contributes to the learning environment. Most of these things can be categorized into one of three areas, which are basically materials, human resources, and content slash teaching methods. So the skill of your teachers, the physical spaces that you're in, the size of the group that you're working with, the methods, the amount of time that you have, the learning outcomes that you're attempting to measure, and the assessment methods that you're using are all going to affect both affect the learning environment itself as well as the student's perception of the learning environment. There's a lot of things that may contribute to the learning environment that you may not consider. Things like transportation. So, where I practice, we have multiple different sites where students are able to rotate, and a student that has to travel an hour to an outlying hospital every day might have a different perception on that environment, given that they have two additional hours of driving every day. Similarly, like things like food. I know if I am hungry, I am definitely going to be in a different mood than when when I don't have a relatively low blood sugar. Things like feeling personal safety going into rooms with psychiatric patients that are potentially violent, or social like previously established social interactions. A lot of these things you can control, and some things that you'll have relatively limited control over. For instance, I don't have a lot of ways to change the culture of nursing at my institution, other than the slow and arduous process of identifying individual bad actors and trying to change their perspective on how we teach and how our students learn. So some things that you will be able to control and others you will not. Some features of the learning environment that would be considered positive or beneficial: you want a welcoming, collegial, and friendly environment, a place that has mutual respect, so the students respect you, you respect the students. An environment that's engaging, team-oriented, and student or learner-oriented as well, as opposed to being more teacher-oriented. Some features of a poor learning environment include lack of communication of expectations, any situation where students perceive a lack of power or lack of empowerment, no sense or no ability to respond to unjust evaluations, too much work or just too much scut work, or any any situation where a student might feel dismissed or disrespected is going to contribute to a poor learning environment. Now, the LCME has 12 standards, one of which, standard 3, addresses the academic and learning environments at medical schools. And what standard 3 essentially is broken down into 6 substandards. And the overarching goal is that medical schools ensure that educational programs occur in a professional, respectful, and intellectually stimulating academic and clinical environments. That medical schools recognize the benefits of diversity in their student population, in their faculty and staff, and in their community outreach programs as well. And that students are able to be an environment that promotes attainment of the competencies required for them to be future physicians. I'm going to go through the individual substandards. The first 4 I'll just briefly sort of graze over, and the last 2 are by the ones that we're going to be talking about most going forward. So LCME substandard 3.1 basically just states that a medical student at any given program has to work at least 1 required rotation or clinical experience with a resident physician that contributes to their learning and contributes to teaching. So this does not necessarily mean that your specific clerkship has to include resident participation. It does not. There are lots of clerkships, even required ones, that are run entirely by faculty or at community sites. That's okay. Just note that at least one of the rotations within your College of Medicine curriculum will have to involve resident physicians. Similarly, at your medical school has to have opportunity for scholarly projects, research, and scholarly writing and publication. Again, not necessarily just for your clerkship. Substandard 3.3 is that your medical school has policies in place that that achieve a mission that promotes diversity in your student, faculty, and administrative staff. And this is an outcome driven. So the outcomes of whatever policy you have will increase diversity amongst those groups. Finally, there's a your medical college must have an anti-discrimination policy that states that you do not discriminate on the basis of age, gender, creed, national identity, origin, sexual orientation, etc. As an example, this is one of many programs that my institution uses to promote and maintain standard 3.3. So this is the MedPath program, which is designed to increase the number of underrepresented minorities within the student group at Ohio State. Okay, so kind of the next 2 are the meat of what we're going to be talking about going forward. And substandard 3.5 is really all about the learning environment and professionalism. And this standard requires that medical schools ensure that the learning environment is conducive to the ongoing development of explicit and appropriate professional behaviors in students, faculty, and staff. And I think this and is important, is that there's periodic evaluation of the learning environment. It doesn't specify how, but it does specify that you create appropriate strategies to enhance a positive learning environment and mitigate any negative influences you have. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about how to do that. And then finally, the last substandard is about student mistreatment, and it states that medical schools must define and publicize a code of conduct for faculty and faculty-student relationships, and then develop a written policy that addresses any violations in this code of conduct. Further, medical schools are required to have a mechanism for reporting these violations of code of conduct that are that ensure that the violations can be investigated without any fear of reprisal or retaliation against the student. So they don't necessarily have to be anonymous. In fact, it's very hard to make them anonymous, but you do have to have mechanisms in place to sort of prevent retaliation against that student, whether it be grade retaliation or social capital, etc. So as I sort of mentioned, you as a clerkship director are responsible for tracking this. And when the LCME comes around, they're going to say, they're going to ask, what issues with the learning environment that you've had. As a brief aside, Dr. House and company do have a descriptive paper from a few years ago where they described their process for identifying issues with the learning environment, as well as a qualitative analysis of what types of issues students are running into. I don't think it was designed or powered to demonstrate that they would create an improvement in this, but I think that's certainly an area of future investigation for in ways of making your learning environment optimized. So there are four kind of basic overarching ways of tracking and evaluating your learning environment. The first is within your end of clerkship evaluation of the clerkship itself. Now these can be, I have them here on a Likert scale. They don't necessarily have to be. It can simply be a yes or no question. This example being the faculty, healthcare team, other staff of this assignment created an environment that promoted appropriate professional values. So that's a yes or no, or you can do it as a Likert. I think the more important thing is that if students answer disagree or strongly disagree, or even disagree, agree equally, you give them an opportunity to explain what they mean, explain the situation, and give you some more insight into how you can in the future improve the learning environment and avoid the same problem going forward. So a different or alternative question: students were treated with respect on the rotation, or supervision of students in the course or clerkship was sufficient to promote a safe environment for you and your patients. So all of these, if the students answer no and give you the opportunity to explain why they don't feel this way, it will give you an opportunity to make changes within the clerkship itself or within the culture of your department. The second way to identify issues within the learning environment is more specific to individual actors, and you can use the standardized evaluation of the clinical instructor and add a question related to how this individual affected the perceived learning environment of that student on that specific shift, such as this teacher treated me with respect, or this teacher treated others with respect, including students, residents, staff, and patients. Oh, sorry. In addition, medical schools are generally required to have a mistreatment reporting system. And here is the example of OSU's. It is not, ours is not an anonymous. You're sort of required to put all of your information in there, how to contact you, so that someone higher up in the medical school can discuss it with you and get some details on what happened and work through how it can be solved. As it turns out, like we have this also available in our sort of vital system, and a big portion of them are accidents. And students, didn't necessarily mean to click that button for whatever reason. Having a sort of a separate system where they have to sort of go in and make an effort, where everybody knows where it is, and that effort is basically minimal, it just can't be done accidentally, is potentially helpful. And then kind of the final way that you can obtain data on your learning environment is through the ACGME graduation questionnaire. The AAMC graduation questionnaire, which has been collecting information on student abuse since around 1992. And the sorts of things that are being collected is whether the student experienced any of several types of mistreatment, and I assure you that the questions are numerous. Who was the source of the mistreatment, how it was reported and who they reported it to, if any actions were taken, and if there was any witness mistreatment of other students. If you would like to copy and paste this is a direct link to the AAMC graduation questionnaire. You can sort of look through it yourself. Some of the questions on there that are directly related to the learning environment are things like the faculty were being respectful to other specialties in consults. Their feedback provided direction and was constructive, that the faculty respected diversity, etc. And then there's some sort of more specific questions aimed at identifying specific behaviors that were focused towards the medical student. So like, was I as a medical student ever threatened with physical harm, or been physically harmed, or been publicly humiliated, etc. I remember when I was filling this out as a medical student, and I remember thinking, at least one time the resident on neuroconsults thwacked me with a clipboard. Do I care about that enough to put it in the AAMC survey? So, that's my perception on the learning environment, but another student, with a different perspective and a different outlook might have viewed that specific interaction completely differently. As I said, these are numerous and go through a variety of specifics, including race, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. And finally, as I mentioned, the AAMC survey does have an opportunity to describe the reporting that the student has done, who they talked to, and what the outcome of that reporting was. Okay, so I think from here, I'm gonna let Dr. House take over a little bit. We're gonna discuss some cases drawn from sort of actual real life events.
So these are, I didn't make any slides of these. These are just cases that we've dealt with, and some topics we've dealt with that I want to kind of to bring up, and kind of goes along with what Matt had talked about. So when we had the LCME come and visit 2 times ago, so not the one that we just finished this year, but before, we didn't have a way for students to do an anonymous reporting at that time. So that was one of our big issues. And so like like Matt talked about, is having that availability to do the online reporting. And for us, students can make it completely anonymous. Now that there is a back door that they can find out who it is if they really needed to, but generally students are able to make it anonymous. They also can delay the report until after they graduate. So giving that opportunity that, hey, I don't want anybody to know about this until after I actually leave the institution. So giving them that availability. The other thing is the students, one problem that creates is they're not able to get back to the student on what the outcomes was. So that was one of the concerns we are continue having with students, is they don't always know what the outcome is of the report, but we don't have their individual name for the most part to kind of report back to them. Matt, if you actually want to go ahead and just you can stop sharing your slides.
Oh, okay.
So that's issues that we've run into. Now, another thing that we often run into is when students, have a question or a concern, but kind of like what Matt said, like, is it big enough to report? Do they really want to report? I always encourage students to report it, with the thought being that if it's a one-time issue, it's not going to cause any problems, but really kind of looking more for patterns. So if one student encounters what they perceive as mistreatment and they don't report it, there's a chance that it's happened to others before them and may happen to others afterwards, and it's a little harder to act upon it without having stuff in writing. So it's one of the things that we try to do, and a lot of times students will report it, and it kind of again goes up to our chair and our dean, and we talk about it, and then it doesn't go anywhere else if it's a one-time thing. And then other times I've had students just no, it's fine, it's not that big of a deal, I don't think we need to report it. So I think they're really encouraging students to use that way to report it if they have any kind of concerns at all about mistreatment. As Matt showed, we did actually publish a little bit about some of the issues that we run into. What we do on at least a yearly basis, if not more often if needed, is we actually will go to our faculty at our faculty meeting and talk about all of the, not just the mistreatment reports that students have done, but even comments that may be perceived as mistreatment on their end of the course evaluations, like Matt talked about. Anything that may have come up on the GQ, so or just faculty evaluations that again can be perceived as mistreatment. So really, we keep it anonymous, but really try to bring it to the group for discussion. So again, people are aware of where we are, where students are at, and how do we correct that on a larger scale. So it's not just going to the individual, hey, Dr. Malone, you said this to the student and they were unhappy. But going to, again, the bigger group saying, hey, this is areas that students have reported that we need to deal with as a group. Again, because sometimes it's not just the individual, sometimes it's the system. A lot of ours, I shouldn't say a lot of them, almost half of ours actually are often involving more nursing or other providers. PAs have come up and sometimes as well. So again, how do you address those? We actually, again, we have that nurse tech shift that I mentioned. So we meet at least yearly with the nurses to review the feedback for that rotation or that shift. We also meet with them and would discuss if there were any professionals of concern or mistreatment concerns with nursing as well. So were any other questions or anybody else want to add anything what they do for mistreatment? All right.
Joe, I have some specific cases we could go through, but I think we're already behind time, so
yeah,
we don't have to. That's fine.
Yeah, I'd say. So Luann put on here for those that didn't see, in terms of learning environment, EM can get into trouble expressing frustration with our students who regularly visit the ED. Students only see these patients once and don't understand our frustration. We have to be careful on what and how we say things to our junior colleagues. So we also, as part of our rotation, have an ethics, just like a paragraph that they write about and we discuss it. Especially early on, that was a big area that students felt was an ethical concern, was how we treat our frequent visitors for substance abuse, those that may come in frequently for chronic pain, and how do you deal with those? Just how do you decide to not give versus give? And sometimes it's just having that discussion with the student about why you may do something or not do something, but definitely if we're voicing frustration with these patients, that can sometimes be viewed negatively by the students. All right, Will, do you want to go ahead and bring up your slides? There's nothing else?
Sure, yeah. All right, hi everybody. I'm Will Peterson again. And warning, we are for this section shortly, not quite yet, but shortly we'll break into breakout rooms. So those of you who are muted and video muted, just giving you a heads up. we will hope for your participation shortly here and want to give fair warning. So I'm going to talk briefly about SLOs, the standardized letters of evaluation we use in emergency medicine. This came about because actually participants in the SAM Clerkship Bootcamp in prior years asked for more information on this, and we thought it would be a good idea to review some of the recent literature on this and discuss, what the SLO is in emergency medicine, how to go about writing one effectively, and some considerations with bias that Jules had alluded to earlier with assessments, how we can think about that with the evaluations or these letters that we're writing for our students as well. So the SLO, so when it's done well, it can be really one of the most important and helpful pieces of information that programs have when they're looking at an applicant. And this is especially true for medical schools that use a pass-fail system for their clerkships. And as we transition from step one being for a numeric score into a sort of binary pass-fail score, this becomes an even more distinguishing factor in applications when residencies are looking at programs. And so it's very helpful to be mindful of the SLO and how it's written and how we go about the process. So the information on these slides is taken from publications. This is not just sort of our opinion on this. This is based on the CORD website, information on how to write this letter, and then various papers that have been published and written on it since then. So this is from the CORD website, that the SLO is designed or developed to be standardized, concise, discerning, and discriminating, and key comments should be succinct and relevant, and make every effort to avoid grade inflation in your comparisons, because we don't want to detract from the effectiveness of the SLO. So we want these to be as honest as possible, and we'll talk about that a bit. This bolding is mine, but a well-written SLO provides an overall perspective on what an individual candidate offers to a training program. It's unique in its ability to provide comparative data to peers, and then important information regarding distinguishing non-cognitive characteristics of patients, or of not patients, of our students, applicants. So maturity, professionalism, leadership, compassion, initiative, enthusiasm, etc. In addition, the written comments should highlight strengths and explain any areas of focus for the student. So shortly when we do break into breakout groups, we will provide information, a sheet of information you'll see on a student with information on clerkship grades that they have, how they did in their emergency medicine clerkship, some comments, select comments from evaluators from the clerkship, and we'll ask you to take that information and practice writing a letter of recommendation for that student encounter. Just to go through what the SLO looks like and the way, some of the things we think about when we're putting it together. Joe House is going to run through kind of the brief form and how we approach it. And then when we move to the writing piece, I'll talk a bit more about that and some considerations with language. So Joe, I'll just flip through, and if you just want to mention any unique aspects of filling this out as we go through it. Oh, and you're muted.
Yeah. So one thing I'll say is, so I actually, when advising, I know Adam's going to talk about advising later, I actually pull up the SLO so students know what our letter looks like, so they know the different aspects that go into it. So we try to be as transparent as possible. I also talk about how we try to use the full, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So, I would say, hey, if we have 12 students going to EM this year, we will have, 4 students that are going to be in the lower third. It does not mean that you are not right for emergency medicine. It's just, we try to use that full range of things. So as Will was talking about, it's got your basic information on there, how long you've known the applicant for, in what ways have you known the applicant, have you worked with them directly? So what we do is we do a SLO writing committee. So it's myself, Will Peterson, Mike Cole, another assistant clerkship director. We have Laura Hobson, who was a previous clerkship director. She was PD and now is associate chair for education. And Rob Huang, who's our program director. So we try to get a wide view of not just from the student side of things, from the resident side of things as well, and then someone who has kind of gone across. So we, that way we can often actually click that we've actually had or worked with that student in the ED. Which we, if it's just one of us writing it, we may not be able to kind of click that box. So again, how long have we known the student for as a part of that? So we're going to go to the next one. So again, how did the student do on our rotation? To get honors pass, high pass, is it the first or second rotation? Sometimes, especially for visiting students, we may not know that information. We do try to get it from the students. Again, and even the visiting students, I try to meet with them one-on-one, just to get to know them a little bit better before I complete the slow. And then, what the distribution of our grades was previously from the previous year. So then, now this is that area that Will kind of talked about that we go through, is trying to compare the applicants to others. And again, Jules touched on this as well. When you've got competency-based evaluations, now you're trying to take that competency-based evaluations and then break it into thirds. So the commitment to emergency medicine, work ethic, willingness to assume responsibility, develop and justify appropriate differential. I'll say what you should do in the narrative, which we'll show in a little bit, we want you guys to work on in a small group, is, especially when people are, vary from it, if you say they're below the peers for, differential, try to describe that, why are they, what does that mean when you say they are, because we have a lot of students, I shouldn't say, we have several students every year who, for the number 7, it says, given necessary guidance, what would you predict the success of that applicant? We may put them in that good, which again would be, if you look kind of higher above, is, or even the number 6 too, again, how much guidance they're going to need, more than peers, what does that actually mean? Is it a student who, has a, interest in research, and they're going to need a little more guidance because they want to continue doing some of that research during residency. So again, when that kind of deviate from your norm, especially if everybody else is as the same as peers, or maybe they need less than guidance, to really describe what that means down below. So we actually will have a meeting where we list all of the students. We'll actually go one by one, and Will, if you want to go to the next slide. And kind of see where they would rank, and that's how we get to our students. So when we met in person 2 years ago, we actually got into our conference room and had sticky notes with everybody's name on there, and we would rank the students, who's our top third, who's our middle third, who's our lower third, and we move students around as we reviewed their total application, and the same sort of thing is where they fall in our application or our potential rank list. And that's why, again, for us, we have the PD and the previous PD on that list as well. So that way we're looking as a collective, and trying to avoid, I think, for a lot of things, again, as Jewel had mentioned earlier, with with biases, we all have things that we really like, or things that we really look for. I think if you're able to have more people involved in your ranking, the better, because again, I think you can potentially get a more holistic review of those individual students. So we also look through their comments, and then if Will wants to go to the next one.
Yeah.
So this is kind of that written comment section. So this is Will has, each year the pool of candidates applying emergency medicine is very competitive. So as I mentioned earlier, just, if you've got someone who's mark in the lower third, that shouldn't mean that they are not right for emergency medicine. That's a discussion to have even beforehand if you think a student is not right for emergency medicine. But again, we really want people to use that full range of thirds. I will say, as you're reviewing applications for residency, when we see someone that, hey, every student that goes to this medical school is, a top third student, you do look a little differently at those applications, or at least I do. Again, this is my own personal bias, than what I would from someone who actually uses that full range of the area. And then there's kind of 250 words there for the written comments to try to summarize that applicant. And this is an area where Jules touched on it, we'll touch on it a little bit too, where we need to be careful of the language that we use. And again, words that may throw out, again, our own biases, and like I said, the words that we choose. And then again, I would say explain any deviations from, people who may need, more, help in some areas, more guidance in some areas, or someone who, like I said, you may end up ranking in the lower third. So here's your kind of time to describe those aspects of the student.
Cool, thanks, Joe. Yeah, so I think the key point takeaway is to be as honest as possible with these rankings as you go through, and recognize that just by putting a student in the lower third category, you're not damning them to a situation where they're not going to match. You're being accurate about how you're describing your students on the whole. And then you can, as Joe mentioned, describe further if somebody is lower third in a particular area, you can use the written area to expand on that and maybe describe some of the challenges that students have faced or sort of justify why you put them in the lower third, but why you think they may do well in residency or not. So honesty is key, and then having the written area to sort of expand on that is a useful tool. There has been thankfully, a lot of recent literature, including a recent JAMA Network publication on the use of language in evaluations and assessments we do of medical students. And so with the SLOs, there's currently no sort of best practices publication on this. And in fact, this may be sort of something that this group could look to collaborate on in the future. But at the moment, there's no best practices for SLO writing. We sort of take the information we have and try to come up with what makes the most sense and guided by what we have so far. But there is recent literature on the language that's used in assessments. And so Joe's alluding to this, Jules was alluding to it earlier. There are certain words that tend to come out and tend to be associated with male applicants versus female applicants, or white applicants versus underrepresented minorities. And it's very helpful to be mindful of this. One of the ways to categorize language is into communality terms, which are defined as sort of relationship-oriented terms of being kind, helpful, concerned, and sympathetic. So those words can be things like help, eager, compassion, happy, kind, caring, friend. And then there are another categorization would be more agentic terms, like agency related. So achievement oriented with focus on being competent, aggressive, independent, decisive, and forceful. And some of these words might include skill, strong, lead, dedication, confidence, active, intelligence, work ethic, hardworking, desire, independent, and achieve. If you map these out, you can see that these descriptors can vary by gender, and these are statistically significant differences. This is a group that looked at evaluations of the medical student level in clerkships over 5 years at 2 different medical schools, and looked at and separated between males and females. What are the words that are being associated with these students, and how are they performing in their clerkships? And you can look at sort of a sample of these, but you can see that over on the right where women are, you're seeing more words like empathic, delightful, energetic, social, warm, caring. And then on the left, more sort of descriptors used for men, you're seeing scientific, deeper, active, relevant, humble, respectful. And so while there is a mix of both communal and agentic words on each side, I think that this starts to point towards trends where you can see associations that are gender-based with the way that we're using words. So the natural question becomes, well, what's the right answer? What should we be doing? And that's a hard question to answer. And we're not proposing a solution to this necessarily, but we do want to point out sort of the objective information we have, which is that there's an existing difference already, and this is mapped in the literature. If we're aware of this, this may help us make some of our unconscious biases more conscious, right? So this may help us be more thoughtful about the words we're using with applicants and thinking about how we're choosing to describe the applicants in our letters. And then the other thing I will say that has been shown in business literature, not medical literature, is that the use of agentic words, so actually I'm going to skip forward a few slides, the agentic words more than communal words has in the business literature been associated with a higher degree of success of getting jobs for applicants when you use words that have more to do with agency than communal relationship building things. That may not be true in medicine, but it's useful to think about, are we showing bias by using words like compassion and happy and caring and ignoring words like hardworking, work ethic, lead, strong, etc., when we're writing letters for applicants. So I think probably the most useful thing to come out of this is to be aware of these differences and how these can exist, to be thoughtful about our word choice, and to try to implement some sort of mix of communal and agentic words and try to make sure that we're not biasing ourselves one way or another towards male applicants, female applicants, underrepresented minorities, white applicants, whatever that may be. And so we wanted to bring it up and just sort of reflect on the recent literature and bring this up for everybody's awareness. So what we will do now, there's something in the chat. Question, has there been programs clerkships that avoid ranking their student cohort? Thoughts on ranking then on what an entering EM intern's competency should be rather than relative to their peers, which seems more arbitrary / relative to strength, weakness of their cohort. That is a good question. I'll defer to Joe and some of the senior people involved.
Yeah, and I'd love to, others' thoughts as well. I'm trying to think back as I've read, applicants applying for residency, and I think for the most part, everybody is using the ranking. But I do agree that some of it is somewhat arbitrary. Again, thinking of where the students lie. I mean, I know when we are talking about the students and we do our ranking, we do try to think of it in terms of when they're starting residency instead of purely on the student to student. I don't know if Luann, Jules, Kendra, Matt, or Adam, if you guys have any thoughts too.
We have a slightly unique system at OSU because we have a longitudinal elective, an honors elective that the vast majority of EM students that are going into emergency medicine do advanced topics. And as part of that, we sort of collate all of their assessment data, both in terms of like end of shift evaluations, OSCEs, I think every student has, all the ATEM students are required to do, I think, 4 direct observations. And we actually build, we do a milestone assessment of them and send that milestone assessment to the programs that that they'll be attending. We're kind of in the early processes of trying to see if that's actually helpful, useful, or if it's even being used by those programs. But it does allow you to more accurately say, these are the student strengths and this is where they are likely to require some help. It would be unrealistic to do based on a single month clerkship though.
So Kendra, just for those that can't see the chat, noted it's hard to convert competency data into normative data required by the SLO, and Jules said it's actually impossible to do so. And Luann said it's driven by the end user needs.
I have a lot of complicated feelings about the SLO, but Luann really hit the nail on the head. Like, in an ideal world, we should define what an entering emergency medicine intern needs to know and be able to do, and judge the students relative to that standard rather than relative to one another. But if I were a program director receiving, 1,500 applications for my 12 residency spots, I would be driven a little bit mad by trying to piece through that. I would want to be able to see students ranked in some kind of way that I could pick the best ones to interview and get on with my life. So I think it's a complicated issue, and the needs of the program directors aren't going anywhere.
And say Luann also mentioned it's concerned it'll be even worse when step 1 goes pass fail. And we have talked about that. Is there going to be more weight put on the SLO and their EM rotations, when that data point has gone away?
All right, good discussion. So we should probably break into groups now. And then once we're broken into groups, we will put in the chat a link to the scenario. And then as a small group, we'll ask each group to sort of work through writing a narrative piece for that student based on the information they have, and then we'll kind of share them together, thoughts on how that went. You can share the writing and sort of any difficulties or thoughts about the process.
Okay, thank you. Let me know when you want me to scroll, team. Oh shoot, I don't have edit access to this, so I can't actually scribe for us.
Interesting.
Let me try my other account.
See if I can scribe for us.
Let me not share this flail with you while I try to get this up on the screen.
I guess we could theoretically, while we're sort of waiting for that, does anybody have any initial reactions or thoughts regarding this patient or this student's objective and subjective data, and how we would want to attempt to write a narrative for them?
How would you describe the student?
Yeah, so I'm new to this kind of position. I'll be starting next year with kind of writing slows. Have not done that yet, but I did think that, you know, she had good scores. I'm not, you know, language-wise, everything was passed. Also, I thought what was beneficial here was she had good, the evaluations were like very thorough from the raters, which I feel like sometimes based on what I've seen in the past on what we'll actually get from various raters is not as quality as what was in this document. So it makes it easier when you're able to have kind of a full picture like that.
Yeah, I would say also I'm similar in that I haven't done any slows, but you know, the student from an objective standpoint seems very strong with high passing EM scores and doing pretty well in the clerkships, but the verbiage doesn't sound like it really sets the individual student apart, you know, an exceptional student per se, but still a very strong candidate. So there's a little disconnect between performance and the commentary, which I don't know if it's good or bad.
Right. So what disconnect are you seeing there? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, you know, in the standpoint of someone that you're looking for as a program director that really stands out, has some exceptional abilities that makes them better than their peers or a great candidate for an EM residency. So the comments are quite objective and kind of focused, which I like. But if I'm a program director and I'm looking for something that pulls this student into my, you know, realm of consideration, is there something that really makes them stand out in my mind based on the narratives? And it doesn't seem like there is. It's just more kind of detail oriented, which I think is the fair way to do it. But like I said, from a program director's perspective, it may not stand out to them.
Yeah, I agree with Tony. It was difficult because I mean, everything on face value does look good, you know, decent scores and solid remarks. I was trying to look for some of the, you know, perhaps, you know, phrases that might be more gender biased or whatever biased. And it seemed pretty solid for the most part, but there was nothing that really set the applicant apart. I didn't know if perhaps specific examples, you know, would be helpful. Although I kind of agree with Tony, like I'm not sure if, you know, you want too many specific examples per se, but like stories, I mean, but they started to go into, you know, making calls, and I was wondering, maybe a little bit more information. Yeah, thank you for putting it up because I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it sounds like it was a difficult situation. So maybe just a little bit more delving into, pulling out the characteristics of why that phone call set that person apart or whatnot.
Does anybody have any thoughts on the additional stuff that the student has been doing outside of the clerkship itself, and what that should, what that work should represent, or how it should be represented in a SLO?
I think it shows kind of more commitment to emergency medicine because she's been involved for multiple years within EMIG, and then also doing research within high risk populations that we see within the emergency department. So it's showing kind of a higher level of commitment to ER, emergency medicine.
Are you guys still seeing the document? My screen just went kerflooey.
It got blurred. Oh, that's better now.
Let me try this one more time. I'm having a hard time here today. Okay, there we go. There's the document. Okay. One more time. All right. So let's back up a minute and kind of look at the big picture of the student. So you start off, you've got boards of 230, you've got grades that are a mix of pass and high pass. You guys have read the comments, and you've got, a couple of relevant volunteer type activities. So just gestalting the student. Again, we all know this is not a real student. We don't know this person in real life. Is this a top 10% student? Is this a top third, middle third, lower third? Where do you think this person is going to shake out in the problematic but very real norm referenced world of SLOs?
Well, one part that stood out to me that made me think that perhaps middle. I'm new to all this too. I've done 1 year of this with a lot of help. So yeah, but like she has high pass and good scores, but it sounded like she still had some room to go as far as being like the owner of her, patient is what it kind of sounded like, her patients. So maybe middle third.
What do others think?
I would say,
Hey.
oh, sorry. I would say top third, but I think, the SLO kind of could do a better job in clarifying the details of what makes her exceptional and talented, and, expand on, like we talked about.
Is it just me, or is Tony breaking up a little bit?
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can now.
Okay, yeah, I was saying I would consider her top third, but probably not top 10 or 15%, just because I think the SLO doesn't really clarify and expand on the details of her outstanding characteristics that it could.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, without comparisons, but she does, have multiple high pass evaluations, showed commitment to emergency medicine. There's no red flags within her application.
So where would that lead you to rank her?
I said kind of top third for now until I get more information to talk otherwise.
So let's just assume we have the information that we have. And this is real life, right? Like sometimes you have some personal knowledge of the student. Maybe you worked a shift or two with them, but odds are this is what you get. You get some evaluation comments, you get some scores and grades, you get, of course, the grade that she earned in your clerkship, but this is what you're able to see. And you've got to kind of decide, I
think we lost Jules.
She froze.
Hey, I can't predict exactly. Oh, you back? Hey, welcome back.
I think so. I hope so. My internet's kind of bad today. I'm sorry. I was just saying, if this is what you got, this is what you got to go on. You know, how do you figure the student shakes out?
So,
Go ahead. I kind of wanted to revise, I mean, my point still remains about it sounds like she still has some room for like ownership and whatnot, but I didn't realize how much high passes is like half her clerkships are high pass. And I know at least for my clerkship, I mean, most people are in the pass, like a mass majority. So, so that's a good point.
So
maybe more top third.
Yeah, that's a really important point, right? We don't have a lot of information about the context for this student. Like if you were looking at this application as a residency director, you would want to look at the dean's letter and see what the grade distribution is, because for all we know, this puts her in AOA, right? At most institutions, though, I mean, she's got tiered grading, so there's pass and high pass. She has no honors whatsoever. So she has kind of like mix of B's and C's is how this would be interpreted at most institutions. So, you take it with a grain of salt based on how the place where she's coming from really grades. But this was, I think, intended to be a pretty middle of the road applicant. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I was just going to highlight that point because I think my interpretation of the data was quite different, because in my institution, we also have tiered grading, but it's very much biased, where most students are the opposite. They're supposed to honor their classes. So if the high pass and pass, they're not a very good student. And so for us, for me looking at this application now with my biased lenses, I'm thinking this student is average to and that's just based off of the lens that you're looking through. I'm not passing judgment on how my school does things, but that's just, and the comments, like you said, they're overall nice job. Like that's not a great descriptor. Like, I don't know what that means. And so, we get so many evals that do exactly this, and I never know how to interpret them because that doesn't mean anything.
To give you and I 100% agree with everything you just said. To give you a slightly different perspective, my college does the exact opposite thing.
Right.
So only the top 10% of students get honors. The next 15% get letters of commendation, and then the remaining 75% get pass. So like this would be like she would be 100% a top third, top 25 student at OSU. If those were her third year grades, like something like more than half of OSU students get nothing but pass their entire third year.
Interesting. So that brings up a really important point about, how essential it is to kind of understand the milieu that your student's coming from to be able to advise them effectively. And for most of us, we're advising our own students. So we know how our own institution's grading system works. We know how our students' information shakes out relative to their peers at our institutions, but we get visiting students all the time as well. And we're often interacting with them and offering them advice, and we need to understand what their situation is. How about these comments, though? So I appreciated calling out the word nice. Like, oh, she did a nice job. That's great. Like that wasn't, this is an exceptional student who blew me out of the water. So what are we supposed to take away from these comments?
They seem a little lukewarm. There's nothing in them that at all that says the student had any problems. They have a good fund of knowledge. They have, they have reasonable plans and reasonable clinical skills. And, so based on the comments, I would say they're probably an average student. Like they don't rub anybody the wrong way, but they're certainly not making, blowing people's minds either.
Absolutely. Very tepid, right? Nice job. Accurate. Good, reasonable. Like, these are not superlative terms. This is definitely not a student who blew anybody away. What do you make? So there's a couple comments here. She can begin to take more ownership of her own patients and actively manage her own patients. So that's what her first rotation says. And then her second rotation says she should keep working on thinking of a broad differential and start thinking about next steps now that she's mastered taking a history. What are they saying about this student?
That she is a successful reporter.
Exactly. I love that you framed it that way, because that was the first thing I thought of, was the rhyme scheme. This student is developmentally a reporter, right? She's able to gather data and spit it back at you. Is she interpreting data and managing patients yet?
Right. So I would say that this would depend on where in medical school that she took these courses, right? So for us, our clerkship is mandatory in the third year, and we're on like a weird curriculum where they're only 16 months in and then starting their clerkships. So this would be a very normal feedback to get for a student that I see at my level. But if this were to be somebody on their sub-I, I think that's concerning, because they haven't gotten to the point where they could function as an intern, right? And that's what we really want to evaluate for these students.
And that is a piece of information we have here. These are M4 rotations. So these are her audition rotations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that line specifically is what stood out to me the most. Yeah, that she's not a manager of patients yet. It's more getting a good history and so forth, reliable information. Yeah.
So then how do we sell this student on the slow? Anybody still want to advocate for her being a top third student, or is this more of a middle third student?
More middle third, I would draw.
Okay. So she's kind of shaking out maybe as middle third, again, with the caveat that depending on the grading milieu in her school, some of this data might be interpreted differently. But certainly from these descriptors, this is not like a top of the pile student. So how do we describe her on our slow? Oh no, 60 seconds, this is too quick.
I think there's opportunity to highlight some of the things that are going to be really important to residency directors, like ability to take feedback and willingness to work on improving. I think those are two things that should be highlighted, because somebody who's already really good but can't take feedback and is unteachable probably doesn't, is a less desirable candidate.
Absolutely. And we have some nuggets of that, right? I don't say anything specifically about feedback, but she's professional, she's collegial, she went the extra mile to, help unravel this complicated situation. She's got good communication skills. This is somebody who's probably going to be fine. She just needs more practice.
All right, welcome back, everybody. So why don't we just do a quick report out. I think we had some good discussions in our group, and I'm sure everybody else did as well. So I think whoever had the first case, do you guys want to kind of discuss what you guys talked about a little bit?
Anybody from our group want to summarize? Dr. Malone?
If no one else is willing, I'm happy to. I think so. If you want to bring up our prompt, you can. Our student had a 230 on step 1, had some pass and high pass, and then had comments that were in generally a little bit lukewarm. There wasn't anything on there that was to suggest that the patient or that the student was a rock star, but there was also no red flags and no concerning features at all. We talked a lot about how the a specific grading scheme of a medical school might change where we put this person. For instance, if if the majority of people get honors or high pass versus only if 25% of people get honors and high pass. But based on the comments alone, I think we decided that this patient or this student would be a middle third student. And then we were going to highlight some of the things that the student supposedly does really well. If you could go back up just for a second. So they take feedback well, they're interested in improving, they're a good communicator, twice on there. In both comments, it described them as being a good communicator. All of those things, while the student might not be a rock star, all of those things suggest that the student is teachable, willing to learn, and good at good at communicating with patients, staff, and other healthcare providers. So all of those things should be in their letter. In addition, we also mentioned briefly that the student has had several years of active participation in emergency medicine, has done some research. So to highlight that the student was dedicated to the specialty and committed. We did not get around to writing it.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, so I think that's fine. I think we end up having cut people a little short on having people actually write things out. So thank you. That sounded great. Group 2 or case 2. Do you guys want to share a little bit of your discussion?
I can share what we talked about and kind of briefly go over the example scenario. Would somebody be willing to just pull up?
I can pull it up.
Great. So this is a student's name was Michael. He had a step 1 score of 205. He does have a history of clinical failures and had to redo his family medicine rotation. Otherwise, he was mostly a pass M2 student. He had 2 evaluations for us, or 2 rotation summaries for us to kind of talk about. Kind of overall, his positives: he was motivated, energetic, hardworking, asked questions, receptive to feedback, and had excellent communication skills. Kind of the negatives seem to center around his actual clinical abilities. So whether or not we would include the failure in family medicine was something we talked about, and we elected to not include it. Needing to read to continue to develop that clinical knowledge, as well as broadening and strengthening his differential diagnoses and plans. So we actually were able to write it. We basically said Michael's motivated, continuously sought out opportunities to learn while in the emergency department. Overall, he was an excellent communicator within the emergency department, both with patients and other healthcare professionals. He was attentive to patient care and details. He may need some additional support with translating his excellent H&Ps to definitive plans, but was very receptive to feedback and showed improvement in his clinical reasoning. We anticipate that he'll be successful, energetic, and highly motivated emergency medicine resident.
All right, thank you. And any other thoughts from anybody else in 2? All right, and our case, let me pull up if I can get this to work here. Try to share ours if you want to, or someone else from our group wants to share a case or talk about what we talked about.
Yeah, I'm happy to summarize.
There it is.
We had a case of a student who performed exceptionally well on clerkships with good scores all around, got honors in their emergency medicine clerkships, and had very nice comments from their home or their academic rotation. But then at their county site that they rotated through, they were again noted to be a tremendous student clinically, very engaged, and had on-point assessments with great attention to detail. But they had a few encounters with patients where this student told patients they were wrong to come to the ED for a problem that they've had for 5 years and should not use Google to try to self-diagnose. And when confronted about the issue, the student brushed it off and said that they understand, but patients don't know the appropriate use of the ED. So our group discussed that this was commented on at one site, but not the other. It might be helpful to try to gather more information from the evaluators who wrote that. But either way, it seemed like a big enough issue that it shouldn't be ignored entirely. And so while in the SLO you could talk about how the student performed well clinically across the board and has consistency there that is exemplary. That this issue that came up should be mentioned in some way, and so there might be a couple different approaches. One approach would be to say, of note, one of the rotating sites noted that the student had this particular issue and state it sort of as a quote, exactly as it was stated in the summary there. And so people can make of it what they will. Or you could sort of summarize and say, this student may require more attention to communication style or professionalism with patient encounters during their residency training, and state, sort of the area in which they may require additional attention to detail. And then if the program wants to reach out to you as the slow writer for more information, they can do that. So we're sort of discussing approaches to how to discuss a professionalism issue like this in a letter.
Yeah, and I'll say that I definitely, when I was doing a lot more reviewing of letters, reached out to a program and try to get a little bit of the backstory, like, hey, this is not a dissimilar student, like, hey, this is a student who sounds like great, but then you had this comment in here, like, what do you mean? What are their circumstances? How big of an issue is this? And it kind of came down to, a little bit of, it was a bad situation. The student just happened to be, interactions with the hospitalist, who is someone who is in leadership position. The person that they were working with was the program director. So again, so lots of background that could explain some of the problems, not all of them, but some of them. But at least it was addressed. So we as a residency have an idea when you're getting these students versus the, matching a student and not knowing that there's potential issues. All right. So thank you everybody for sharing. We're gonna, so there is, let's say, Jules, is it Tuesday or is Wednesday your session?
It's tomorrow.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah,
there is a whole
Yeah.
advising session that Jules is on for panel that's tomorrow, but we still wanted to touch base on things today, just briefly. So Adam's going to share, but Jules, what time is it so people know?
Yeah, if anyone wants to come tomorrow, it's 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central.
So Adam, if you want to go ahead and share for your advising. Do you want me to pull your slides up?
I have, I'm not allowed to share. If you want to click the buttons, or maybe if one of our support staff can help us.
Oh, so you got kicked out.
Yeah, my computer decided that it was going to reboot and update in the middle of this.
We'll make you co-host.
Thanks.
Okay, try again.
All right. So we'll talk a little bit about student advising, though we've touched on this a little bit today. I'm going to kind of just briefly do an overview of what we do. Everybody's system is a little bit unique. And I think one thing with student advising that I've found is that it's really dependent on the student. We have some students that come in day one and they just know that they're going to go into emergency medicine and they want to meet with us a lot, do a lot of shadowing, get involved with research early on. And then we have other students who may even decide in July, August of their fourth year that they want to go into emergency medicine. So it varies a lot depending on the student. So I'm going to talk kind of more about what our average advising looks like, and then a couple of the specific scenarios that we talked about with the slow writing. As far as group advising goes, we primarily start this in January prior to the match cycle. So January of their M3rd year, we get together with our residency education team as well as our medical student education team. And we have about a 2-hour session on what the application cycle will look like, what we're going to ask from them, what they're going to need to be expected to do in terms of applying to away rotations, scheduling their emergency medicine rotations, what an average step score is going to look like, what the slow is, how to get a good slow, and going on from there. From then on, we kind of have some individual meetings, and we require all of our students to meet with one of our medical student education team at least once they get their step 1 back, so we can kind of get a sense as to who they are as an applicant. Did they do well on step 1? Do they have prior history with emergency medicine that we should be aware of, and potentially have them kind of collaborate with people within the emergency department? Do they have any red flags that we should be aware of? Are there any like professionalism concerns? And just how do we think they'll look as an emergency medicine applicant? Then during their 4-week rotation with us, we meet with all of our students as part of their mid-month feedback. We take a look at all of their evaluations. Our admin team is able to kind of like heat map everything. So we kind of take a look at the raw numbers and see how they're doing, as well as the descriptive comments from our faculty. And it's another good area for us to get feedback from the students as to how they think they're doing, what their insight is into their strengths, their weaknesses, and how do they feel that the rotation's going? Are they still feeling like emergency medicine is right for them? And then we try to meet with them all again pre-ARIS submission, where we go over their personal statement and what their application list is going to look like. This is where it gets a little bit individualized even more, depending on how receptive the student is to feedback on their application list and what everything is going to look like, and how strong of an applicant they are. I think the benefits to having these meetings is you can kind of build that relationship. I'm sure we've all written slows where it's like, who is this person again? I don't think I worked with them. I'm not quite sure what all of these comments are about. So you can kind of build that relationship. Also, kind of when you have to deliver difficult news later on, or kind of guide your mentee through some difficult scenarios, it can be helpful to have that relationship. Cons is it's obviously time consuming to do this, although I think it's been lessened a little bit with the ability to do virtual meetings much easier. So I will say, when we're talking about advising students, it's similar to everybody's talked about today. Advising students is similar to teaching students. Everybody's got a different style and kind of more or less receptive to other people. So that can be difficult. So let's talk a little bit about the average student that we talked about. And so knowing where your student is going to fall in terms of their application, I think is really helpful. And that's why we like to do our meetings really early on, to kind of know what their step scores are, know what their class performance has been up to their emergency medicine. And then as soon as they're on the rotation, we like to meet with them within that 2 weeks, so we have some objective data to talk to them about and kind of show them where they fall compared to their peers. I think this is really similar to delivering bad news in emergency medicine. And it's helpful to tell a student, hey, your scores with us are average compared to your peers. Your step score is average compared to your peers. This is going to affect your application cycle. You're not going to be able to apply to all of the geographically interesting areas and plan on having a successful match. Yeah, I think it's also helpful that they know what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and kind of go from there. Then kind of going to the below average student. I think this can be really difficult, and this kind of falls into what we were talking about with Will and Joe talking about the slows. You can have a student that's below average or lower third, and that doesn't mean they're not going to match into emergency medicine. And then you're going to have other students who, after their emergency medicine rotation, after you've seen their step scores, you kind of know their cumulative class performance, you may decide, hey, I think matching into emergency medicine may be a difficult thing for you. And at that point, I think it's really helpful to engage other people in this student's life, whether or not they have any long-term mentorship from the medical school, whether or not they have any like long-term clinician coach. Is there a different specialty that they've considered? Can you reach out to the clerkship director from that potential other specialty, and just try and get multiple opinions on the student, and kind of, over the course of time, let them know what your thoughts are professionally for their match into emergency medicine. And then professionalism concerns, I think this is kind of a very broad topic in terms of what is the professionalism concern. I think that you need to have as much information as possible on this. Did this happen in the clinical realm? Is this something where a student failed a class and it's going to be very evident on their MSPE that they failed a class and they're going to address that in their personal statement? And then can you, advise them on that? Is that something that you're going to include in your SLO? Is this potentially a criminal issue where they're going to have to disclose this and this is going to be discoverable, and they're going to mention that in their personal statement, and they're going to mention that in their ERAS statement, and kind of how are they going to word that? I think it's going to be really dependent on the scenario, and it's going to really depend on what the situation is in terms of your advising of the student. But I think at the end of the day, having the most information that you can. And then potentially seeking outside opinion too as to how to navigate the match for that student. In summary, I think advising students is very hard, as everybody here knows. Trying to get as much objective data early on the prospective applicants can be helpful. Trying to build those relationships for mentees is helpful in terms of advising them, but also I think helpful for us in terms of giving us gratification for what we do and trying to keep open lines of communication. I think when we've had bad advising in the past, it's, a lot of the times a medical student that you can't ever get to respond to an email, you can't get to listen to anything. So trying to find good ways to have that communication. And then don't be afraid to enlist outside help from other mentors, other specialties, other experts in your field to try and give your students the best advice as possible. Any questions?
Thank you, Adam. And so one thing I'll just kind of add to it, he's talked about, really sitting down with the student. And I mean, I'm sure we've all seen on the listserv about the letters and people kind of sharing what's in the slow letters and who should be doing that. And I think just really being open and honest with the student, and I try to do that. And I've had students who have been really appreciative, and I've had other students who never wanted to meet with me again, except for when it was soap day. And when I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry," and their response was, "Well, it's not like you didn't tell me this." So that was a little less satisfying. But again, I think being honest with students, so that way, it's not a surprise that they're going to potentially struggle, or and we've been very open about, you should consider another specialty. What would be your backup plan? And hey, if you couldn't do emergency medicine, what would you want to do? Or hey, your chances are going to be really low. And I've had students again who said, "I don't want to do apply," and then it's kind of like, well, okay, well, we'll see how things go. Anybody else have any other comments? All right. So I think we're a little bit over on time. Why don't we do a quick break? So why don't we come back at, I'm looking at 1:30 Eastern time. Does that work for people? And as Luana mentioned before, if you want to just not log out, but just mute yourself and turn your video off, and we'll meet back again about 1:30. I think, Lou, if you want to go ahead and get started.
All right, so thank you, everyone. I know it's been a long day, and so I'm going to go through these slides, but I want to invite people to stop and ask questions along the way. How many people, have folks been involved with an LCME visit or had things coming up? If you just want to use an emoji or sort of type in the chat box. This lecture could probably actually be entitled "The Things I Wish Someone Had Told Me When I First Became a Clerkship Director," because pretty quickly after becoming the clerkship director, we actually had an LCME site visit coming up. And while I'd been involved in curriculum committees along the way, I don't think that folks had really told me what to expect with the LCME. I think I knew there was some sort of accreditation thing, but not much more than that. And certainly no one had ever taken the chance to tell me about the rules associated with it. So this is really, it's an opportunity for self-assessment. And I would encourage everybody, if you have not been involved in one, to go. There is a data collection instrument that's out there available on the LCME website. And I would encourage everyone just to take a peek through it if you haven't. It gives you a lot of information, and it provides the context of the way in which people ask questions, which is really helpful in understanding the process. And it also provides some insight into that some of the things that seem very clear when you look at the depth and degree of information that are required are not things that you may keep up with on a regular basis. So it's an opportunity for peer review. And I'd really encourage everyone to think about this as a way for institutional improvement. The entirety of the process really starts about a good 18 months in advance of an LCME site visit. And I would, and done in a less stressful way. It's a continuous process and starts well in advance of that. But it's the completion of a data collection instrument. There's student surveys. All of this information is taken into and reviewed and analyzed by institutional stakeholders that you may have the opportunity to serve on some of these committees. And then there's going to be higher stakes sort of self-assessment judgments related to this. And all of this information is going to be provided to the LCME before a site visit actually occurs. There are 12 different standards within LCME accreditation standards and a number of different elements within these. The things that we are really going to be focused on today are elements 6 through 9, which have to do with the curriculum and a couple of other pieces along the way. I think this is an excellent opportunity for you to think about what's your role as a clerkship director, how can you be involved in the process, and overall, I think emergency medicine physicians are really early adopters. We're more flexible in terms of change. And we've had to do that in our clinical environments. And so sometimes I think you can really help, even as a junior faculty member, really be a leader in thinking about what are the opportunities in which you can help ensure that your institution receives accreditation, and it may be able to create a path for you to have larger scale involvement and to think about what are the other opportunities for your career and how might you want to be engaged with this. So the whole goal of this is actually improving. That isn't the way everyone on the team will see it and how other clerkship directors, but this is really an opportunity for early identification of where your challenges are. And I would encourage you, as much as I've worked with some folks in the past who have said, you know what, we just have to check the boxes. And checking the boxes isn't actually going to bring you any source of enjoyment or fulfillment, and it will not result in long-term improvements to your clerkship. But if you really embrace the process of quality improvement and look for opportunities, I think there are ways that we can ensure that our students have a much more rigorous and a better learning experience that really sort of starts with making sure that we meet the educational objectives that we've set forth for our students. And so if there have been problems related that have been cited in your accreditation visits in the past, please make sure that you know what those are. This information isn't always passed forward to you as a clerkship director. And so sometimes you have to ask these questions and find out where they are in other clerkships, because sometimes there's opportunities for you to fill a gap. There are a number of frequently cited standards. The one related to strategic planning and continuous quality improvement, you personally are not going to have a significant amount of control over that. But I would encourage you to ask your institution if they have a process for that, find out what it is. And this is really, I think this has probably been the place where there's been the most movement in terms of LCME and their expectations regarding that. And so this is an opportunity to get involved on a larger scale. A number of schools have actually CQI, educational CQI committees that look at LCME standards as a separate process and surmise what are the opportunities. And so we're going to hit on some of the ones that are related to opportunities where you can improve. These pictures are from our clerkship committees and the various roles in which some of our faculty have played between our refuse to participate in this to the, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening again. And so when we think about this, how can you contribute? So one of the requirements for the LCME is 9.4, and this is a requirement for direct observation. Now, specifically, they're going to ask questions about all of the core clerkships, but since many of us have rotations that are in the M4 year, I think just like Jules mentioned, that the global rating sort of influences perceptions that we have when we're working with students and evaluating them. The recency bias does actually probably help students recall what they have and have not been seen, and whether or not they have been observed doing a history and physical. And so there's really a great opportunity, especially for people who have teaching residents in the emergency department, to do direct observations of students and provide them with quality feedback. We've parsed this out in different ways amongst all of our various clerkships, but emergency medicine is really the only clerkship for our institution that does a really complete direct observation and can hit a couple of those throughout their rotation, which the students find incredibly beneficial, and our residents help with that as well. It's also an opportunity for you to include OSCEs within this, to include simulation, as long as you're providing the learners with feedback. And there are other LCME standards that require narrative assessment, as well as formative feedback that you could link with that as well. There are two places in the LCME where we actually have to call out what are our required clinical experiences and how do we monitor this. So in 6.2 and 8.6, they actually define what are the types of patients and clinical conditions that we expect our students to see. What setting do these have to be involved in? What is the expected level of student responsibility? And if the student can actually see the patient in your clinical setting, how do we actually provide them an alternative learning experience? And so these are things that are typically decided at the curriculum committee level, and then they're parsed out amongst the various required rotations. So if you do have a fourth year required rotation, I would encourage you to take ownership of some of these. Definitely for the acutely ill patient, this is an excellent way for emergency medicine to be able to contribute to the larger scale curriculum. The caveat of this is this has to be monitored at both the clerkship level, and they're going to want to know how you control that as the clerkship director to ensure that these are done. And then there has to be a higher level of monitoring at the central curriculum level to ensure that all students have completed these in order to be able to graduate. And these consist of both the clinical experience and patient types, as well as procedures. And so they're going to ask that you, do you have policies in place? What is the way in which this is done? And when I first became a clerkship director, this was really sort of kept in a handwritten document or a checklist. And now it's built into our learning management system, and we're able to generate reports. But it's also helpful for the students to understand that this is a requirement, since this is something that the students don't frequently enjoy doing. No one ever told me in the very beginning of being a clerkship director that grades absolutely must be reported within 6 weeks. And so I don't really know any type of way around this other than making sure that they're done. I would suggest that people have the goal of 4 weeks and recognize that there are going to be times when it takes you a little longer than 4 weeks to be able to accumulate all of the necessary evaluations that you need. But this is, to me, is one of the most inflexible things. And numeric data has to be turned into the LCME that shows the average number of days in which that the clerkships actually have to complete this information and whether or not it was submitted on time. So you definitely don't want to be the clerkship that's out of the norm on this one. Also, the LCME requires that we provide students with formative assessment and feedback. And this, for 4-week clerkships, it's required that this is done at the midpoint in a structured type of way, so that there is time for remediation for them in the remainder of the rotation. What we found is that even though we did this with every single student, the students would still come up and they would check. It's a dichotomous. Were you provided with mid-rotation feedback, yes or no? We would still have students who would check the no box, which was incredibly frustrating as the clerkship director when you were like, I can pull out a piece of paper and document that this was done. So we had incorporated a process where the students actually have to perform a self-assessment initially. And while I'm sure that they don't enjoy it, it does actually help generate conversation for the mid-rotation feedback. It helps you understand the students' perceptions of what it is that they would like to learn and how they're performing. But it also helps them actually recall that they did receive feedback as a part of this component. And the students in their independent student analysis are actually going to comment on whether or not they thought that the feedback was useful. So we also use this opportunity to review their patient log of the required conditions. All of these are actually now built into our learning management system. So we're able to incorporate all of the comments from all of the evaluations so that students can review those on an ongoing basis. As Jules talked earlier, the shift card, I would describe these as formative feedback after each shift. To me, that is a continuum, but it also meets one of the additional requirements for narrative feedback. And I think this is something that the clinical clerkships actually do pretty well compared to some of our preclinical clerkships, where it's harder for them to envision what narrative feedback looks like. But I always tell our students that they're able to see the shift evaluations at any point in time, that is formative feedback so that they can change their behaviors along the way. And then ultimately, those are going to be a component of the summative grade for the students. Curriculum management is a little more challenging. And so the LCME really expects that there is a central oversight committee. Sometimes as the clerkship director, I felt like I was the czar of at least my clerkship universe, and that isn't necessarily true. So all changes have to go through a Central Committee for Curriculum Oversight. It's really the institutional learning objectives that need to drive the curriculum objectives, and I would encourage you to be extraordinarily cautious when discussing with the LCME if you use like the CDEM learning objectives that have been mapped out. Because I think that's what all of us wanted to say, was we use these national objectives, but the LCME is extraordinarily particular that they want individual institutional learning objectives should be like a waterfall and drive all of the objectives that are instituted as part of the curriculum. And there has to be oversight to make sure that they're integrated amongst all of the clerkships and the courses so that those institutional learning objectives are achieved for each individual student by graduation. But if there are major changes, most institutions actually have some type of policy, whether written or unwritten, that there's certain things that have to go through the curriculum committee. So if you are new in your role, I would ask your institution for clarification as to what those things might be so that you have a better understanding and can fulfill that obligation. And then additionally, you have an obligation to make sure that things are going well. So we've already talked about evaluations of the clerkship. You are going to have access to those at least on a yearly basis, sometimes sooner. And so we actually, our institution actually does yearly evaluations, and we have begun incorporating the chair of the department into those conversations so that we can help improve chair buy-in and support for the curriculum as a whole. But there are also going to be larger scale initiatives that are going to impact you. And so larger scale curriculum reviews, like typically a three-year review. And the clerkship, the curriculum committees are responsible for integration, both in a horizontal and vertical fashion across all of the phases of the curriculum. And so at times they're going to ask you to make changes in order to make sure that they're fulfilling the various LCME requirements that might have broader impact than just your clerkship. Make sure that your clerkship objectives are all competency-based, driven by your medical school's objectives. Previously I'd used the terms link them, but then that implies that your objectives came first, and that, again, that is not desirable to the LCME, and they have to have measurable outcomes that can be linked so that you can determine the programmatic outcomes for the students, as Jules alluded to. There's also it's really important to be able to demonstrate that all of your residents and faculty who are teaching know what the objectives are and that these are distributed. When our last LCME visit was, well, we had one in July and we had one about 8 years ago. And at that point in time, they were really just taking it for granted when we said we provide this at the departmental level. At our most recent LCME visit, they were very clear that we want this to be able to document it on an institutional level, and would ask questions like, what do you do when someone isn't trained or hasn't completed the training? And so we have actually moved towards having this as an online module that's required for all of our residents. And we require that all of our faculty and residents actually sign off on our objectives for documentation. Comparability across sites is going to be something for folks to think about, especially for those of you who have a number of sites. You have to be able to document that you have similar outcomes, that students make similar grades, that they have access to similar similar types of patients, and that similar educational opportunities. And so a number of these things you can meet by ensuring that they're able to, by looking at your procedure, your patient experience logs, that they have access to similar, the curriculum and the core curriculum experiences. But you may want to take a deeper dive and look more closely at things like, if you're using a shelf exam, are their grades similar at each of the sites, and are the evaluations of the clerkship similar for students who rotate across each of the sites? Because you will be asked questions about that if you have a required rotation. This typically does not affect emergency medicine as much, but occasionally we do end up caring for our students who become patients, especially related to psychiatric patients in the ED. In the event that you have this situation occur, that faculty member who is taking care of that student can no longer participate in any assessment or promotion role for the student, and you would have to recuse yourself of that. This is a much bigger issue for our psychiatric colleagues, but it has happened in our rotation in the ED where we had a student issue, and so be aware of those. Interprofessional teams is a requirement for LCME, but it's one that sometimes I think emergency medicine faculty that we can really add to. And just as Joe was mentioning that there's an opportunity to work with nursing for nursing shifts, these are ways that we can demonstrate that we have interprofessional experiences that some of our other colleagues may not have the flexibility to incorporate into rotations. And so again, something that you can think about. And so every year you need to really take the time to make sure that you have competency-based objectives with measurable outcomes, making sure that you really review all of your evaluations, and when there are recurring themes that you address all of those, and really the other thing that frequently is not considered are affiliation agreements. So each of the facilities and hospitals in which students work have to have affiliation agreements, which typically occur at the institutional level. But if you're using community faculty, you have to ensure that whatever your institution's process is, that each and every one of those members have faculty appointments, because at many times they will ask for documentation of that when the LCME comes to visit. And so I know that was a quick sort of 20 minutes of a rapid overview of this, but making sure your grades are turned in, mid-clerkship feedback, the comparable experiences, and hopefully that gives everyone a quick overview of some of the ways that you can either contribute to bringing about better experiences with LCME, and just to make sure that you know where the lanes in the road are. So I'm going to pop over, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to take those as well.
I will say that one of the areas that we kind of got, I don't want to say trouble for, but one of the areas that we have to work on is, so our students can rotate to multiple different sites. 3 of the 4 sites, they're our own residents, so it's not an issue, but we do have one of the sites that are not our residents. So like Luann kind of mentioned, it's not just good enough to say that they receive training on how to work with students. We actually have to document that they attended this session, which is required for them already. So we have to create a way to document that they receive training on how to work with medical students, not just say they receive training. All right, so we've got a little less than 10 minutes, so we can, feel free to ask any questions about any of the sessions, or just in general about being a clerkship director. There was a question about the slides from today's being available. I know that the session is being recorded. We did not provide them directly with the slides, so I just have my email address in there in the last message, so people can email me, if they do want the slides, and we can make sure we get them to you. No questions? All right. I want to thank everybody for joining us. As Luann mentioned, this is a long session, kind of jumping headfirst into SAEM with a 4-hour session. So thank you for joining us. Is Adam, Will, Luann, I don't know if Matt's still on, and if you guys want to, Kendra, share any last minute thoughts?
I just want to say thanks for being here. I'm going to put my email in the chat if people have questions, or just want somebody to bounce ideas off of. I would be more than happy to talk to anyone who wants to reach out.
Yeah, and I'll encourage people to get involved in CDEM, or at least make sure that you are on the in the group, because there's lots of people that, again, you can bounce ideas off, questions off, concerns off of. A lot of us have probably been in your shoes before, and may have experienced some of these things, and may have some ideas on how to work through them. So please get involved with CDEM as well.
I agree. Thanks everyone for coming. And I think the community of CDEM has been just so incredibly instrumental in my career, and sort of having the opportunity to learn from others, and has been one of the most rewarding aspects. So thank you all for coming, get involved, and please let us know if there's any questions we can answer or help you with.
Thanks everyone.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.